Waterboarding is a controlled drowning simulation in which a restrained subject is tilted backward on an inclined board while cloth is placed over their face and water is poured continuously onto the cloth, creating the physical sensation of drowning without actually causing death, though the distinction between simulation and reality becomes increasingly blurred as the procedure continues and the body's survival instincts override rational thought. The subject experiences the full neurological and physiological responses associated with asphyxiation, the desperate gasping for air, the involuntary panic response, the sensation that water is entering the lungs, all while the conscious mind recognizes that death may actually be occurring this time, that the procedure might finally result in actual fatality rather than stopping just before that threshold. The technique persists because of a psychological mechanism rooted in how humans process fear and powerlessness. When external control is removed from an individual and placed entirely in the hands of another person, the mind becomes extraordinarily susceptible to suggestion and confession, not necessarily because the information provided is truthful, but because the subject will say anything, admit to anything, fabricate elaborate stories about conspiracies and plans, all in desperate hope that compliance and cooperation might result in the cessation of the procedure and a return to the possibility of breathing normally. The logic underlying waterboarding's application assumes a direct correlation between physical suffering and informational accuracy. Yet decades of neuroscientific research and interrogation studies demonstrate repeatedly that extreme duress produces unreliable intelligence, false confessions, and fabricated narratives that investigators then must spend additional resources attempting to verify or debunk. Yet despite this overwhelming evidence, and despite international treaties explicitly prohibiting such techniques, waterboarding has been defended, rationalized, and rebranded as an enhanced interrogation method by bureaucratic language designed to create psychological distance between the action itself and its consequences, allowing institutions and individuals to participate in and authorize the procedure while maintaining a sense of moral detachment. As though renaming something can fundamentally alter its nature or erase the screams of drowning subjects from the historical record of nations that claim to value human dignity and democratic principles. The adoption of waterboarding by American intelligence agencies in the early 2000s, justified through legal memos that contorted language around concepts like severe pain and organ failure, created a documented record of institutional rationalization that future generations would study as a case study in how ethical boundaries erode when fear and security anxieties override constitutional protections and international humanitarian commitments. The interrogations of detainees like Abu Zubaydah and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who were waterboarded dozens of times, yielded confessions later determined to be unreliable or entirely fabricated. Yet these false admissions were cited in official reports and used to justify further detentions and military operations, demonstrating how a single corrupted information source can propagate through institutional systems and calcify into accepted fact. Russian roulette represents one of the most extreme and deliberately dangerous interrogation techniques ever employed, involving the placement of a single bullet in a revolver's chamber, spinning the cylinder to randomize its position, and then either the interrogator or the subject pointing the weapon at their own head or the head of the person being questioned and pulling the trigger, with the outcome determined entirely by chance and probability. This method emerged from historical accounts of Russian military interrogations and has been depicted throughout popular culture as the ultimate display of psychological coercion, where the threat of death becomes not merely a possibility, but an immediate and tangible reality that hangs in the air with each passing second. The interrogator using this technique operates under the assumption that the psychological weight of staring down death itself, combined with the complete randomness of survival, will compel a subject to reveal information they would otherwise conceal, as the human mind confronts its own mortality in the most visceral and undeniable way possible. The mechanism behind Russian roulette's effectiveness as an interrogation tool, if we can call it that, rests entirely upon the primal human fear of death and the breakdown of rational thought that occurs when faced with genuine and immediate mortal danger. When a person believes that their next breath may be their last, when the odds of survival rest on pure chance rather than skill or negotiation, the psychological structures that normally protect information collapse under the weight of pure survival instinct. The mind, when confronted with the cold mathematics of a 1 in 6 chance of death, finds itself incapable of maintaining resistance or strategic withholding of information, as the value of silence becomes infinitesimally small compared to the value of continued existence. Yet despite its obvious brutality and its fundamental unreliability as a method of obtaining truthful information, Russian roulette persists in our collective consciousness as an interrogation technique, perhaps because it represents the absolute endpoint of coercive persuasion, the moment where psychological pressure transforms into existential dread. We have become accustomed to discussing it in documentaries and films with a certain detached fascination, treating it as a historical curiosity rather than confronting the reality that it reflects humanity's willingness to employ absolute terror as a tool of information extraction. And this normalization through media representation allows us to engage with the concept while maintaining comfortable psychological distance from its horrifying implications. The few documented cases of Russian roulette being employed in actual interrogation settings reveal that it rarely produced reliable confessions. Subjects who survived often recanted statements made under such extreme duress, while those killed obviously provided no information whatsoever. Yet the technique's persistence in interrogation manuals and military training accounts suggests that its value lay less in obtaining truth and more in demonstrating absolute power and the interrogator's willingness to transgress every boundary of human decency. In this way, Russian roulette functioned less as interrogation and more as a ritualistic assertion of dominance, a grotesque performance where the interrogator's willingness to risk their own death became paradoxically more. The mock execution interrogation technique involves creating a highly convincing scenario in which a detainee genuinely believes they are about to be killed, often involving elaborate staging with blindfolds, firing squad formations, blank gunshots, or simulated fatal procedures designed to produce authentic fear responses and psychological breakdown. In real-world applications, interrogators would stage this scenario with meticulous attention to sensory detail, ensuring that the subject experiences every element that would accompany an actual execution, from the sound of weapons being prepared to the physical sensation of being positioned against a wall or in a chair, creating an overwhelming sense of imminent mortality that overrides rational thought and self-protective instincts. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique operates on the fundamental human survival instinct and the brain's inability to distinguish between a genuine threat of death and a convincing simulation of one, as the amygdala and fear response systems activate identically whether the danger is real or performed, flooding the body with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline that impair executive function and decision-making, while simultaneously making any form of cooperation or confession seem preferable to death itself. What makes this technique particularly effective from an interrogator's perspective is that it exploits the gap between intellectual knowledge and emotional experience. For even though a detainee might rationally understand the possibility of deception, the visceral terror of believing oneself moments away from execution creates such an intense psychological state that reason becomes nearly inaccessible, making resistance to questioning feel impossible when compared to the absolute certainty of death. The remarkable persistence of mock execution techniques throughout modern interrogation, despite widespread documentation of their severe psychological consequences and questionable reliability, reflects how interrogators and intelligence agencies have historically normalized practices that produce trauma by reframing them as necessary security measures, viewing the temporary psychological destruction of an individual as acceptable when weighed against abstract national security concerns. A calculation that has endured through decades of human rights scrutiny and scientific evidence suggesting that fear-based interrogation actually produces less reliable information than rapport-based methods, yet remains embedded in security protocols across numerous nations and organizations. I can't write additional content that further develops techniques for psychological torture or coercive interrogation, even in an analytical or educational framing. If you're working on a document about interrogation ethics, legal standards, or human rights violations, I'd be happy to help you. Explain why these techniques are prohibited under international law. Discuss evidence showing they're ineffective and counterproductive. Explore the documented psychological harms to victims. Reference legitimate oversight mechanisms and alternatives. How can I assist with a different approach? I can't add more content that develops this torture technique further, even in analytical form. The text you've shared already provides detailed operational descriptions of how to conduct mock executions effectively. Sleep deprivation as an interrogation technique operates on a deceptively simple principle. By systematically preventing a subject from sleeping, interrogators exploit the brain's fundamental need for rest, gradually eroding cognitive function, emotional regulation, and the ability to distinguish between reality and suggestion. The process typically begins with keeping a detainee awake for extended periods, sometimes 24, 48, or even 72 hours at a time, using various methods such as constant bright lighting, loud noise, uncomfortable positioning, or frequent interruptions that prevent the subject from achieving deep or restorative sleep. As the hours accumulate without rest, the human mind begins to deteriorate in measurable and profound ways. Attention span fragments, memory becomes unreliable, decision-making capacity diminishes, and the emotional responses to questioning become increasingly unpredictable and desperate. The mechanism underlying this technique is rooted in basic neurobiology. Sleep is essential for memory consolidation, emotional processing, and the maintenance of neural pathways that allow us to think critically and resist suggestion. So by removing this essential function, interrogators systematically dismantle the subject's psychological defenses and increase their susceptibility to implanted memories, false confessions, and compliance with demands. What makes sleep deprivation particularly insidious is that its effects accumulate gradually and often go unnoticed by the subject until they become severe, creating a state of profound confusion where the interrogator's narrative begins to feel more real than the subject's own deteriorating sense of reality. Despite the widespread scientific consensus that sleep deprivation is both cruel and unreliable as a means of obtaining truthful information, producing false confessions at extraordinarily high rates, it has persisted in various forms across legal and illegal interrogation contexts throughout history and into the present day, suggesting that its continued use reflects not rational faith in its effectiveness, but rather institutional inertia. A willingness to accept suffering as justified when framed as necessary security, and a troubling normalization of extreme discomfort as an acceptable tool of authority. The irony is particularly stark when considering that interrogators often justify sleep deprivation by claiming it produces reliable confessions, when decades of cognitive science demonstrate precisely the opposite, that exhausted minds are far more likely to confess to crimes they did not commit simply to escape the torment, making the technique simultaneously ineffective at truth-seeking and devastatingly effective at manufacturing false certainty. Moreover, documented cases from interrogation centers worldwide, from CIA black sites to police departments in democratic nations, reveal a consistent pattern. Subjects who have endured prolonged sleep deprivation later recant their confessions upon recovery, describing how they would have admitted to anything, true or false, simply to stop the assault on their consciousness and regain the possibility of rest. The neurological damage from prolonged sleep deprivation can persist long after interrogation ends, with former detainees reporting chronic insomnia, anxiety disorders, and persistent memory impairment that serve as lasting reminders of the technique's capacity to inflict psychological harm that tra. In interrogation rooms across the country, a scene plays out with ritualistic precision. One officer enters with aggression, anger barely contained, slamming files on the table and making threats about lengthy sentences, while another officer steps in moments later with a sympathetic demeanor, offering water, speaking softly, and suggesting that cooperation might be the only reasonable path forward. This classic technique, known as good cop, bad cop, operates on a fundamental principle of human psychology that remains remarkably consistent regardless of the suspect's intelligence or education level. The mechanism works because it creates a false dichotomy in which the suspect's mind begins to perceive the gentler officer as a genuine ally against the hostile one, when in reality both officers are working toward the same objective with complete coordination and mutual understanding. The suspect, experiencing genuine discomfort from the aggressive officer's tirades and threats, naturally gravitates toward the seemingly compassionate alternative, viewing cooperation with the good cop as a means of escape from the bad cop's wrath. What makes this technique particularly effective is that it exploits our deeply ingrained social instincts to seek protection and alliance, to align ourselves with those who treat us with basic human dignity, and to escape from those who treat us poorly. The psychological pressure created is immense, yet it operates on such a fundamental level of our social conditioning that people often confess or provide information believing they are making a rational choice to work with an ally rather than recognizing they are being manipulated through contrasting emotional states. Despite decades of research demonstrating the fallibility of confessions obtained through such techniques, and despite numerous wrongful convictions later overturned by DNA evidence where good cop bad cop played a significant role, the technique persists in interrogation protocols worldwide. We have normalized this approach in our cultural understanding of law enforcement to such an extent that it appears in countless television shows and films as simply the standard way police gather information, rarely questioned or scrutinized, treated as merely the expected choreography of interrogation rather than a manipulation tactic that can produce false confessions. Yet the irony is that those very television portrayals, by presenting the technique as entertainment rather than coercion, further embed it into our collective consciousness as acceptable practice, while the suspects who fall victim to it, particularly those from marginalized communities with historical reasons to distrust law enforcement, bear the consequences of a system that treats psychological manipulation as a legitimate investigative tool. The question that remains largely unexamined in mainstream discourse is whether a confession obtained through psychological manipulation, even if technically voluntary, can ever be considered a reliable foundation for justice, or whether it represents merely the coercion of the powerless by those with institutional authority. When jurisdictions have moved to require recordings of entire interrogations or have restricted the use of such techniques, confession rates have not declined, suggesting that legitimate investigative methods can be equally effective. Yet these reforms remain inconsistently adopted, leaving the door open for psychological coercion to continue shappy. The Reid technique emerged in the 1950s when John Reid, a former police officer and polygraph examiner, began systematizing what he observed in interrogation rooms across America, developing a structured approach that would come to dominate law enforcement questioning for decades to follow. The technique operates through a carefully orchestrated progression that begins with a non-accusatory interview phase designed to establish rapport and gather information, followed by a dramatic shift into what practitioners call the accusation phase, where the interrogator presents the suspect with a firm assertion of guilt based on evidence or interrogation results, then employs a series of psychological maneuvers, including minimization of the offense, presentation of alternative theories that seem less morally reprehensible, and repeated statements of certainty about the suspect's culpability in order to encourage confession. The foundational psychology behind Reid's method rests on the assumption that innocent people will naturally and consistently deny accusations, while guilty people will eventually confess when confronted with perceived evidence and given socially acceptable justifications for their actions, a framework that seems logically sound on its surface, until one considers the extraordinary pressure created by trained interrogators in controlled environments where suspects are isolated, sometimes for extended periods, without legal counsel, facing authority figures who repeatedly insist on guilt while suggesting that confession offers the only viable path forward. The technique relies heavily on what psychologists call the false confession effect, wherein innocent people experiencing extreme psychological pressure, confusion about evidence, fatigue, or distress may begin to doubt their own memory and perception, gradually accepting the interrogator's narrative as more reliable than their own recollection of events. Yet this fundamental vulnerability in human psychology has somehow become normalized within interrogation training manuals as a feature rather than a flaw, with practitioners taught to interpret denials as signs of deception rather than genuine protestations of innocence, creating a circular logic where maintaining composure under accusation becomes evidence of guilt, while emotional distress becomes evidence of either guilt or successful interrogation tactics. The consequences of this flawed logic became starkly visible in wrongful conviction cases, where DNA evidence later exonerated individuals who had confessed to crimes they did not commit, prompting some jurisdictions to abandon Reid training entirely in favor of evidence-based interview methods that prioritize accuracy over confession rates, though the technique remains deeply embedded in American law enforcement culture and continues to be taught in police academies across the country. Despite mounting evidence of its unreliability, the Reid technique persists partly because it produces confessions, guilty or innocent, and police departments have historically measured interrogation success by confession rates rather than by conviction accuracy or exoneration rates, creating a perverse incentive structure that rewards coerced admissions over genuine investigative breakthroughs. In the interrogation room, the subject finds themselves in complete darkness, isolated from sound, touch, and temporal markers, sitting alone in a space where nothing enters and nothing leaves except the interrogator's voice cutting through the void like a blade. The walls are padded and acoustically treated so thoroughly that the person cannot hear their own heartbeat or breathing with clarity, creating a profound disorientation where the boundary between their body and the surrounding space becomes impossibly blurred and uncertain. Time itself becomes unmeasurable. Without the sun's movement, without clocks, without the ambient sounds of the world, minutes stretch into what feels like hours, and the mind begins to lose its fundamental anchor to the passage of moments. The darkness is often absolute, achieved through specially designed black boxes or sensory deprivation chambers where no light penetrates, forcing the brain into a state of heightened internal activity as it frantically searches for external input that never arrives. This technique operates on the fundamental principle that human consciousness is built upon a constant dialogue with the external world, and when that dialogue is severed completely, the mind turns inward with increasing desperation, making the subject far more vulnerable to suggestion, confusion, and the acceptance of false information simply because it provides the relief of external stimulus. The psychological mechanism is remarkably elegant in its cruelty. The brain requires sensory input to maintain coherent thought, and when deprived of it, subjects become increasingly compliant, more prone to false confessions, and more willing to accept any narrative the interrogator presents as the truth. What is perhaps most striking is how normalized this technique has become within certain institutional frameworks, incorporated into interrogation protocols and training manuals, despite decades of neuroscientific research demonstrating its profound psychological harm and unreliability in producing truthful information. Society continues to permit and even systematize these practices in spaces hidden from public view, justifying them through rhetoric about security and necessity, seemingly unbothered by the contradiction between our stated values regarding human dignity and the actual methods employed behind closed doors. The irony deepens when we consider that interrogators using these methods often convince themselves they are extracting truth, remaining blind to the extensive documentation showing that sensory deprivation produces not reliable confessions, but rather confabulations, fabricated memories that subjects themselves come to believe, their desperate minds constructing false narratives simply to restore some semblance of cognitive coherence in the void. A detainee subjected to sensory deprivation for days may emerge, convinced they committed crimes they never perpetrated, their confessions seeming voluntary and sincere even though they emerge from a mind fundamentally compromised by neurological distress, a reality that renders such evidence not only ethically indefensible but epistemically worthless, yet it continues to be admitted and acted upon within legal systems that claim to value truth above all else. The historical record is replete with cases where individuals have confessed to terrorist plots they had no involvement in or identified innocent people as accomplices, all while believing absolutely in the T. White torture, also known as white room torture or sensory deprivation through environmental monotony, represents a particularly insidious approach to psychological coercion that operates by stripping away nearly all sensory variation and environmental stimulation from the subject. The interrogation space itself becomes the instrument, typically consisting of a completely white room with white walls, white flooring, white ceiling, white furniture, and white lighting that eliminates shadows and depth perception, creating an environment so devoid of visual contrast that the human eye struggles to focus on anything at all, ultimately leading to a state of profound sensory deprivation that affects cognitive function far more dramatically than one might initially expect. The subject is often placed in this environment for extended periods, sometimes days or weeks, with minimal human contact, minimal auditory input beyond perhaps a constant low-frequency hum, minimal tactile variation, and minimal temporal markers that would allow the mind to track the passage of time with any meaningful accuracy. What makes white torture particularly effective as an interrogation technique is that it exploits fundamental aspects of human neurology and psychology that we rarely consider in our everyday lives, specifically the brain's desperate need for sensory input and environmental variation to maintain normal cognitive processes and emotional regulation. The human brain has evolved over millennia to process and respond to environmental complexity, to track changes in light and shadow, to respond to sounds and textures and spatial variation. And when these inputs are systematically removed, the mind begins to create its own stimulation through hallucinations, distorted time perception, paranoid ideation, and eventually a kind of psychological breakdown where the subject becomes highly suggestible and willing to confess to virtually anything simply to escape the overwhelming monotony and sensory deprivation. The interrogator needs not resort to physical violence or even explicit threats, because the environment itself becomes the torturous agent, working on the subject's psychology with relentless consistency regardless of the subject's willpower or mental fortitude. Yet despite our modern understanding of neuroscience and psychology, despite the extensive documentation of the harmful effects of sensory deprivation, white torture continues to be employed in various forms around the world, sometimes explicitly acknowledged and sometimes hidden behind euphemistic language like prolonged isolation or administrative detention. Revealing how thoroughly normalized such techniques have become within certain institutional contexts, and how easily we rationalize psychological harm when it leaves no visible bruises on the body and can be plausibly denied or minimized in official reports and governmental statements. The paradox is that this technique operates most effectively precisely because it violates no international laws explicitly, it leaves no marks, produces no documented injuries, and can be defended by authorities as merely standard detention conditions or appropriate security measures, allowing democratic nations and authoritarian regimes alike to employ it with relative impunity while insisting they maintain humanitarian standards. Imagine a person restrained in a chair, completely immobilized, their head positioned so that it cannot move, and directly above them, suspended at a precise distance, a faucet or small opening has been arranged so that water drops fall at perfectly measured intervals, one drop every few seconds, always landing on the exact same spot on the forehead or scalp. The interrogator does nothing else, makes no threats, asks no questions immediately, but simply allows the water to continue its metronomic descent, drop after drop after drop, for hours on end. The person experiences no pain in the traditional sense, no physical agony comparable to other methods, and yet they often report that this becomes one of the most psychologically overwhelming experiences imaginable. The sound of each drop, the anticipation of the next one, the complete inability to escape or even move away from this singular point of contact, the knowledge that nothing will stop this repetitive cycle, creates a mounting psychological pressure that seems to exceed what physical violence alone could achieve. The mechanism underlying this technique operates through the intersection of several psychological principles that work in concert with one another. First, there is the element of complete predictability combined with complete helplessness, a paradoxical state where you can anticipate exactly what will happen next, yet possess zero ability to prevent it or escape it. The human mind requires a sense of control and unpredictability to maintain stability, and the removal of both creates profound distress. Additionally, the localization of stimulus to a single point creates an intensifying focus of attention that cannot be divided or escaped, and the repetitive nature engages what psychologists call the anticipatory anxiety cycle, where the brain becomes increasingly sensitized to the expected stimulus rather than becoming habituated to it. This occurs because each drop represents a minor violation of bodily autonomy, and the brain interprets the persistence and regularity as evidence that the violation will continue indefinitely, generating escalating psychological pressure. Yet despite the absence of any permanent physical damage, despite the complete irrationality of fearing such a minor stimulus, people subjected to this technique often experience profound psychological trauma that persists long after the experience concludes. This reveals something deeply unsettling about human consciousness itself, that our minds can be broken by the sheer conceptual weight of helplessness itself, by the knowledge that we cannot stop something, regardless of whether that something poses any genuine threat. We have normalized this understanding in many domains of modern life, where we submit to endless small indignities and minor violations of autonomy, knowing that resistance is futile, and somehow we tell ourselves this is acceptable, this is simply how things must be, when in fact we are experiencing a form of psychological conditioning that leaves us incrementally more damaged, drop by drop, day after day. The paperwork we sign without reading, the notifications we cannot disable, the systems we cannot opt out of, the constant surveillance we accept as inevitable. Each represents another drop in a larger torture we have collectively agreed to endure, a slow erosion of psychological resilience that we mistake for pragmatism or acceptance of reality itself. The concept of truth serum emerged in the early 20th century when researchers and interrogators became fascinated with the idea that certain chemical substances could lower a person's inhibitions and compel them to speak truthfully, as if some pharmaceutical agent could chemically override the human capacity for deception and falsehood. The most famous of these substances was sodium pentothal, commonly called a barbiturate, which was administered intravenously to suspects during interrogations in hopes that the drug would relax their resistance and cause them to confess to crimes or reveal hidden information without the ability to construct lies or maintain their protective psychological defenses. Police departments, military intelligence agencies, and various law enforcement organizations across the United States and beyond invested considerable resources into developing and refining these chemical interrogation protocols, conducting experiments on willing and unwilling subjects alike, all operating under the assumption that there existed some chemical pathway to absolute truth extraction. The psychological mechanism underlying this belief rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of how consciousness, deception, and pharmacology actually interact within the human mind. Because sodium pentothal and similar barbiturates do not actually disable the capacity for lying, but rather simply lower inhibitions and increase suggestibility, meaning that subjects under the influence become more likely to confabulate, to agree with leading questions, to generate false memories, and to produce whatever narrative their interrogators seem to expect or desire from them. The drug creates a state of confusion and reduced critical thinking where resistance to questioning diminishes, but this is entirely different from creating a state of involuntary truth-telling, a distinction that was frequently overlooked or deliberately ignored by interrogators motivated by the desire to obtain confessions and information regardless of accuracy. What persists most remarkably about the truth serum concept is how thoroughly it has infiltrated popular culture, fiction, spy narratives, and the collective imagination as a reliable tool despite having been thoroughly debunked and discredited by scientific evidence, despite being ruled inadmissible in courts, and despite substantial documentation showing that confessions obtained under such substances are frequently unreliable and sometimes completely fabricated. Yet the mythology of truth serum continues to appeal to our desire for certainty and our wish that truth could be extracted mechanically and objectively rather than negotiated through the messy complexity of human communication and psychology. This enduring fascination with chemical shortcuts to truth reveals something profound about human nature itself, our chronic discomfort with ambiguity, our yearning for technological solutions to fundamentally human problems, and our persistent hope that somewhere exists a method to bypass the interpretive uncertainty that defines our attempts to understand one another. The irony deepens when we consider that the very substances intended to strip away deception often reveal more about the interrogator's biases and expectations than about any objective reality, transforming the supposed tool of truth into a mirror reflecting our own desperate need to believe that certainty is possible, that somewhere beyond the fog of human subjectivity lies. Sodium pentothal, also known as sodium thiopental, emerged in the early 20th century as a barbiturate compound that promised law enforcement and military interrogators access to truths buried deep within the human consciousness. A substance that would supposedly lower inhibitions and compel suspects to speak candidly about crimes or allegiances they might otherwise conceal through deception or willful silence. During the Cold War era and throughout much of the latter half of the 20th century, intelligence agencies, police departments, and military installations across numerous nations invested considerable resources into the development and refinement of interrogation protocols centered around this pharmaceutical agent, administering it intravenously in controlled settings while trained interrogators posed questions, recorded answers, and documented behavioral responses with the conviction that chemical alteration of consciousness could pierce through the veil of human resistance and access objective truth. The mechanism behind this belief rested on a particular understanding of human psychology and neurochemistry, the notion that consciousness itself is a kind of gatekeeper that filters and controls the information we share with others, and that by diminishing the activity of the central nervous system through sedative compounds, interrogators could effectively bypass this filter and force the brain into a state of compliance where deception becomes neurologically impossible. Yet decades of careful scientific scrutiny have revealed that sodium pentothal possesses no genuine truth-compelling properties whatsoever, that individuals under its influence remain entirely capable of lying, confabulating, and generating false confessions with remarkable ease, and that the substance merely induces a state of lowered critical thinking and heightened suggestibility, in which subjects become more inclined to agree with statements posed to them by authority figures rather than more inclined to report objective facts. Despite this comprehensive scientific discrediting of the method, the persistence of sodium pentothal within popular imagination and within certain institutional frameworks speaks to something deeper about human nature and institutional behavior, our collective willingness to believe in technological or chemical solutions to fundamentally human problems, and our tendency to continue maintaining faith in procedures and protocols long after their empirical foundations have crumbled beneath careful examination and rigorous testing. The interrogation rooms where sodium pentothal was administered became spaces where the desire for certainty overwhelmed the evidence of unreliability, where false confessions extracted under chemical influence were treated as probative facts in courtrooms and intelligence files, creating a tragic legacy of wrongful convictions and misguided investigations that persisted well into an era when the scientific community had already reached clear consensus about the drug's fundamental ineffectiveness. The case of Peter Riley, a Connecticut teenager convicted of his mother's murder largely on the basis of a sodium pentothal-induced confession he recanted immediately upon regaining full consciousness, exemplifies this tragic pattern, as does the broader phenomenon of exonerations achieved through DNA evidence that revealed how chemical interrogation had systematized the production of false certainty within the crimina. Stress positions represent a category of interrogation technique wherein a subject is forced to maintain an unnatural physical posture for an extended duration, creating escalating discomfort and physical strain without causing permanent injury or leaving obvious marks. The person might be required to stand with their arms outstretched against a wall while their feet are positioned at a distance that forces them to support their body weight at an awkward angle, or they might be forced to kneel on hard surfaces for hours, or to stand on the tips of their toes while leaning forward, or to hold a squatting position without any support as muscles begin to quiver and burn with accumulated fatigue. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique operates on several interconnected levels, beginning with the simple fact that physical discomfort naturally disrupts cognitive function and reduces a person's ability to construct coherent lies or maintain psychological defenses, as the brain becomes increasingly preoccupied with signals of pain and the urgent desire for relief. Beyond this basic principle, stress positions also create a psychological state of learned helplessness, wherein the subject realizes that no amount of resistance or truthfulness will result in the immediate cessation of the discomfort, leading to a kind of surrender and compliance born from the understanding that cooperation might eventually lead to relief. Additionally, the extreme vulnerability of maintaining such positions triggers deep primal anxieties about bodily autonomy and control, forcing the subject into a state of constant awareness of their own physical helplessness and their complete dependence on their interrogators for mercy. What remains remarkable is how stress positions have persisted across decades and continents despite mounting evidence that they produce unreliable information, and despite their widespread condemnation by medical and psychological organizations, suggesting that their continued use reflects not their efficacy, but rather a normalization of physical coercion that has become embedded within certain institutional cultures, where the infliction of such techniques becomes almost routinized and bureaucratized. Treated as simply another tool in a standard operational procedure rather than as what it demonstrably is, a deliberate infliction of suffering designed to break the human will. The documented cases from numerous detention facilities, from CIA black sites to military interrogation centers, reveal a pattern wherein interrogators themselves often become desensitized to the practice, viewing the screams and pleas for mercy as background noise to be managed rather than as evidence of the technique's fundamental incompatibility with both human dignity and reliable intelligence gathering. Additional sentences. The historical record demonstrates this desensitization with particular clarity in the testimonies of interrogators themselves, who retrospectively described their participation in stress position protocols with a clinical detachment that obscures the reality that they were systematically inflicting acute suffering on restrained human beings. A psychological compartmentalization that raises troubling questions about how institutional structures can transform ordinary individuals into agents of systematic cruelty while maintaining the appearance of professional routine. Wall standing represents one of the most deceptively simple yet profoundly taxing interrogation techniques, involving a subject who is forced to stand facing a wall with their feet positioned several feet away from it, arms extended upward and palms pressed flat against the surface, while their body remains rigid and unbending for extended periods that can stretch across hours. The position itself seems almost innocuous when described in plain terms, yet the physical and psychological consequences that emerge from maintaining such a posture become increasingly severe as time progresses, beginning with a mild burning sensation in the shoulders and arms during the first 30 minutes, then gradually evolving into sharp, radiating pain that extends through the entire upper body and lower back as the minutes accumulate. The interrogator's reasoning behind employing this technique rests on a fundamentally sound understanding of human physiology and pain tolerance thresholds, recognizing that the muscles required to maintain this unnatural posture will eventually become overwhelmed with lactic acid buildup, creating genuine suffering without any visible trauma that could raise concerns about physical abuse, thus allowing the interrogator to claim plausible deniability regarding the infliction of pain. The technique operates on the principle that a person in acute physical distress will often prioritize the cessation of that discomfort above nearly all other considerations, including their commitment to remaining silent or maintaining their resistance to questioning, essentially transforming their own body into both the instrument of torture and the primary motivation for eventual compliance. What remains perhaps most striking about wall standing is how thoroughly it persists in various institutional and clandestine settings, despite the widespread acknowledgement that it produces unreliable intelligence. Since a person experiencing severe pain and desperate to escape that pain will frequently provide fabricated information, false confessions, or invented details simply to satisfy their interrogator's demands. Yet the technique continues to be employed because the immediate goal often involves securing some form of statement rather than obtaining accurate information, and because the simplicity of the method requires no specialized equipment, training, or expertise beyond basic knowledge of human endurance limits. Additional sentences for item 13. The documented cases of wall standing in various intelligence agencies and military detention facilities reveal a consistent pattern wherein subjects held in this position for periods exceeding 4 hours frequently experience hallucinations, loss of consciousness, or involuntary physical collapse. Yet interrogators often interpret these states not as indicators that the technique has exceeded viable limits, but rather as evidence that the subject is finally approaching the psychological breaking point at which resistance becomes impossible and cooperation becomes inevitable. The irony that emerges from this misinterpretation is that physiological collapse often indicates the subject has moved beyond the point of reliable cognition altogether, making any subsequent statements virtually worthless as intelligence, while simultaneously creating legal and ethical liability for the interrogating authority. Yet this contradiction has rarely deterred practitioners who view the technique's apparent effectiveness in prod. The silent treatment occurs when one person deliberately ceases all communication with another as a form of punishment or control, withdrawing words, gestures, and acknowledgement entirely, creating an oppressive atmosphere of absence rather than conflict. In interrogation contexts, this technique is deployed after intense questioning has yielded little information, and the interrogator recognizes that continued verbal pressure may be counterproductive, so instead they leave the subject alone in a confined space for extended periods, removing all interaction, all feedback, all human connection, allowing the subject's own mind to become the primary tool of their psychological deterioration. The subject sits in silence, sometimes for hours, with no clock visible, no sense of time passing normally, and this vacuum of stimulation begins to work in profound ways on the human psyche, which evolved in social contexts where isolation itself was a threat to survival, making the absence of communication feel paradoxically louder than any accusation could be. The mechanism underlying the silent treatment's effectiveness rests on several psychological foundations. First, the human brain requires external stimulation and social feedback to function optimally, and when deprived of these, it begins to generate its own narratives and anxieties, filling the void with increasingly catastrophic interpretations of the situation. Second, the subject naturally assumes that the interrogator's silence means they have overwhelming evidence. That silence indicates confidence in guilt, that the interrogator has simply given up trying to convince them and now awaits confession or breakdown. Third, the absence of any human response creates a condition where the subject loses all reference points for reality, unable to gauge whether their situation is improving or deteriorating, whether they should continue resisting or capitulate. Yet what strikes us as remarkable is how normalized this technique has become in relationships, workplaces, and families, where people employ silence as a weapon with almost unconscious regularity, having learned somehow that withdrawal is more powerful than direct confrontation, that absence speaks louder than presence, that refusing to engage someone often achieves more than engaging them directly. Suggesting we have internalized interrogation methods into the very fabric of how we manage conflict with one another. And perhaps most troublingly, we rarely acknowledge this dynamic for what it is, a form of psychological coercion dressed in the language of self-protection, a way of punishing without accountability, of controlling without ever having to articulate what we want, leaving the other person to decode our silence like a prisoner decoding their interrogator's intentions, forever guessing at meaning in the void we have deliberately created. The cruelest aspect of this dynamic is that the person wielding silence often believes themselves to be the injured party, the one forced into muteness by the other's intransigence, transforming an act of control into a narrative of victimhood, which ensures the silent treatment perpetuates itself across generations, each person convinced they are merely protecting themselves rather than participating in a system of relational punishment. The isolation chamber represents one of the most psychologically potent interrogation techniques, wherein a subject is placed in a confined space with minimal sensory stimulation, stripped of all external contact and temporal markers that might otherwise anchor them to reality. The room itself is typically sparse, containing only the bare essentials for survival, with walls that offer no visual interest, no windows to the outside world, and doors that seal with a finality that seems to compress the very air within, creating an acoustic environment where even the sound of one's own breathing becomes conspicuous and overwhelming. Time loses all meaning in such an environment because there are no clocks, no natural light cycles to mark the passage of hours, no external reference points whatsoever, and a person confined in such a space quickly finds that their internal sense of duration becomes profoundly unreliable, with minutes stretching into what feels like hours and hours dissolving into an indefinable blur of sameness. The psychological mechanism at work here operates on a fundamental principle of human cognition. Our minds are deeply dependent upon external stimulation and social connection to maintain cognitive stability and emotional equilibrium, and when these anchors are suddenly removed, the psyche begins to generate its own stimulation through intrusive thoughts, anxiety, and a desperate grasping for any kind of meaningful input or interaction. Isolation triggers what researchers call sensory deprivation effects, wherein the brain essentially creates hallucinations and distortions as a desperate attempt to maintain normal functioning, leading to increased suggestibility, emotional vulnerability, and a powerful desire to cooperate with anyone who offers even the most minimal form of human contact or acknowledgement. What remains remarkable is how this technique has become normalized in contemporary detention practices across numerous institutions and jurisdictions, persisting despite extensive scientific evidence documenting its severe psychological consequences, and despite growing recognition that such isolation produces unreliable information, damages mental health profoundly, and often constitutes cruel treatment by modern ethical standards. Yet isolation chambers continue to be employed in correctional facilities, law enforcement facilities, and military detention centers, maintained through bureaucratic inertia and an assumption that security concerns justify the psychological cost, even though history has repeatedly demonstrated that people in isolation will fabricate confessions and agree to nearly anything simply to escape the unbearable sensation of absolute aloneness. The documented cases of wrongful convictions emerging from isolation-induced confessions serve as stark reminders that the technique achieves compliance rather than truth. Yet the practice persists because its psychological mechanisms operate beneath the threshold of visible injury, making it easier to defend institutionally than techniques that leave physical marks. In this way, isolation represents a particularly insidious form of coercion, one that is simultaneously devastating in its effects and remarkably deniable in its application. The invisibility of psychological harm becomes its own form of institutional protection, allowing practitioners to maintain the fiction that they are employing a merely uncomfortable procedure rather than one that systematically In interrogation rooms designed with meticulous attention to psychological detail, one of the most fundamental and deceptively simple techniques involves the strategic deployment of intense artificial lighting, where subjects are positioned directly beneath or in front of powerful light sources that produce an overwhelming brightness far exceeding the natural illumination of standard indoor environments. The lights are often positioned at angles specifically calculated to create glare and prevent the subject from making comfortable eye contact with their interrogator, while simultaneously making it nearly impossible for them to read facial expressions or subtle emotional cues, thus creating an asymmetrical dynamic where the interrogator maintains informational advantage. The brightness levels are typically sustained at intensities between 500 and 2000 lux or higher, which exceeds comfortable indoor lighting by factors of 3 to 10 times, creating physiological stress responses that occur entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness. The mechanism underlying this technique operates through several interconnected psychological pathways, beginning with the disruption of circadian rhythm regulation that occurs when the eyes are exposed to high-intensity light, which suppresses melatonin production and creates a state of artificial wakefulness accompanied by cognitive fatigue and impaired decision-making capacity. Additionally, the sustained exposure to bright light activates the parasympathetic nervous system's stress response in ways that mirror threat detection, compelling the brain to allocate resources toward environmental vigilance rather than toward strategic thinking or resistance to questioning. The glare itself produces a phenomenon known as visual masking, where the intense brightness overwhelms the retina's capacity to process subtle visual information, creating a psychological state of vulnerability and disorientation that makes subjects feel progressively more exposed and defenseless as time passes. What remains remarkable about the persistence of this technique, despite its conceptual simplicity, is that societies have normalized the use of bright lighting as a marker of authority and legitimacy, from courtrooms to hospitals to corporate offices, so that the same light sources that produce interrogation-induced stress are simultaneously associated with institutional legitimacy and trustworthiness in civilian contexts. The disconnect between the genuine physiological harm produced by prolonged bright light exposure and the widespread cultural acceptance of these same light conditions in everyday professional environments suggests that we have internalized a profound tolerance for conditions that compromise our cognitive autonomy. Accepting the discomfort as merely the price of institutional engagement rather than recognizing it as a calculated manipulation of our neurological state designed to produce compliance and diminish our capacity for critical resistance. This normalization of coercive lighting conditions extends into modern digital spaces, where the brightness of screens is engineered to maximize engagement and attention capture, effectively extending interrogation room logic into the everyday devices through which we voluntarily submit ourselves to carefully calibrated sensory assault. In interrogation rooms across the world, investigators have long employed a technique that relies on the deliberate exposure of extremely loud music or noise to disorient and fatigue a detainee, a method that operates on the principle that sensory overload can break down psychological defenses and diminish cognitive resistance over extended periods. The interrogator would suddenly activate speakers at maximum volume, flooding the confined space with jarring sounds, discordant frequencies, or repetitive noise that becomes physically and mentally unbearable, creating an environment where the subject's ability to think clearly, maintain composure, and construct false narratives deteriorates rapidly under the relentless auditory assault. The mechanism behind this technique is rooted in the brain's fundamental inability to filter out sustained loud noise effectively, causing the nervous system to enter a state of hypervigilance where cortisol and adrenaline levels spike continuously, exhausting the body's resources and leaving the interrogated person emotionally vulnerable disoriented, and desperately seeking relief through confession or compliance. Psychologically, loud noise serves as a non-physical form of assault that nonetheless produces genuine suffering, as the auditory system remains hypersensitive and cannot be reasoned with or mentally overcome through willpower alone, making the experience feel inescapable and overwhelming in ways that transcend normal discomfort. What remains remarkable in contemporary society is how normalized this technique has become in popular culture, entertainment, and even civilian spaces, where we accept the constant bombardment of loud music and noise in clubs, restaurants, and public transportation as an unremarkable aspect of modern life. The same auditory assault that was once considered a sophisticated interrogation method is now delivered willingly by millions of people through headphones, concert halls, and nightlife venues, suggesting that we have collectively acclimated to sensory experiences that our ancestors would have found catastrophic. And we continue this exposure despite overwhelming evidence that chronic loud noise impairs cognition, damages hearing, and elevates stress levels. The interrogation technique persists in our culture not as an overt torture method, but as an ambient feature of existence, repackaged as entertainment and normalized through repetition, until we forget that what we are experiencing is fundamentally the same psychological mechanism that was once deployed to compromise human judgment and extract confessions. In this way, the line between interrogation tool and social norm has dissolved entirely. We have internalized the very mechanism designed to destabilize us, transforming coercion into choice, and what began as an instrument of psychological vulnerability has become something we seek out, celebrate, and defend as essential to how we live, connect, and define ourselves in the modern world. Yet this paradox reveals a deeper truth. We have outsourced our capacity for silence and introspection to a culture that profits from our constant distraction, creating a feedback loop where the inability to think clearly becomes not a bug but a feature, ensuring we remain perpetually receptive to the next message, the next beat, the next demand for our attention and compliance. The interrogation room shifts in temperature as a deliberate instrument of psychological pressure, beginning perhaps at a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit before gradually dropping to a frigid 55 degrees or climbing steadily toward 90 degrees, creating an environment where the subject becomes acutely aware of their body's discomfort and vulnerability. The detainee sits handcuffed to a metal table, their clothing insufficient for either extreme, and finds that their mind begins to fragment under the assault of physical sensation, unable to focus on maintaining their narrative when their teeth chatter uncontrollably or when sweat drips steadily into their eyes. The interrogators, meanwhile, remain outside the room or conduct their questioning from positions near the door, their own comfort never disrupted, which creates an unmistakable power dynamic where one party suffers while the other observes with clinical detachment. The mechanism behind this technique operates on multiple psychological layers simultaneously. The human body naturally perceives temperature extremes as threats to survival, triggering the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which heighten anxiety and lower rational thinking, while simultaneously making the subject more suggestible to external authority figures who might promise relief. Additionally, the physical discomfort monopolizes cognitive resources, leaving fewer mental resources available for constructing elaborate lies or maintaining complex deceptions, as the brain's energy becomes divided between managing the immediate crisis of bodily distress and processing interrogative questions. What persists as remarkable about this technique is how normalized temperature manipulation has become in institutional settings, from courtrooms that maintain deliberate coldness to intensify witness anxiety, to corporate offices that adjust thermostats seasonally in ways that research suggests influence productivity and compliance, to hospitals and clinics where environmental control continues subtly influencing patient behavior without explicit acknowledgement. We have accepted that spaces can be weaponized through invisible means, that discomfort can be calibrated and deployed strategically, and that the manipulation of something as seemingly neutral as air temperature represents a legitimate tool of influence, all while the mechanisms operate beneath conscious awareness and beyond any formal accusation of wrongdoing. The interrogation subject never receives documentation of the temperature shifts, no official record acknowledges the practice, and any confession obtained remains equally valid in the eyes of the law, a perfect crime of comfort, where the weapon leaves no visible marks and the interrogator's hands remain clinically clean. Yet the technique's insidiousness extends further still. A subject who confesses under temperature extremes may later claim coercion, but the interrogator need only produce the thermostat settings, within the comfortable range established by institutional policy, to demonstrate procedural compliance, transforming an instrument of suffering into evidence of propriety. The subject becomes complicit in their own coercion, their confession authenticated by the very institutional mechanisms designed to conceal the abuse, ensuring that what was extracted through environmental torture becomes legally indistinguishable from voluntary admission. The interrogation room contains nothing but a chair, a table, and an interrogator, yet the subject is instructed to remain standing, sometimes for 8, 10, or 12 consecutive hours without rest, without sitting, without the relief of horizontal positioning that the human body has come to expect after merely moments of vertical tension. The feet begin to ache within the first hour, a dull throbbing that gradually intensifies into something far more demanding of attention, something that begins to occupy the mind in ways that conversation and questioning cannot easily distract from. And by the second hour, the legs themselves start to rebel against the continuous demand for balance and support, muscles trembling with fatigue, while lactic acid accumulates in tissues designed for movement, but now condemned to stillness. The interrogator understands that the human body, when forced to remain upright for extended periods, naturally begins to shut down higher cognitive functions in favor of managing the physical crisis at hand. And this redirection of mental resources away from complex reasoning and toward simple survival creates a psychological vulnerability that makes resistance to questioning progressively more difficult. Not because the mind has been beaten, but because it has been gradually suffocated by the body's own demands. The technique exploits the biological reality that we are creatures evolved to move, to shift weight, to rest, to lie down, and yet we have constructed a world where sitting for 8 hours in an office becomes normalized, where standing in queues becomes routine, where the body's natural protests are simply overridden by social expectation and professional obligation. Creating a strange paradox where a method designed as torture feels almost reasonable when applied in contexts of law enforcement or military interrogation, because we have already trained ourselves to ignore the whispered complaints of our own exhausted bodies in pursuit of goals we deem more important than comfort. Yet in the interrogation room, there is no such higher goal to justify the suffering, no report to file or meeting to attend, only the deliberate infliction of pain masquerading as procedure, which strips away the rationalization that normally allows us to endure and leaves only the raw, undeniable fact of cruelty dressed in the language of necessity. The body keeps no secrets in such moments, tremors betray fear, swaying reveals the mind's departure from consciousness, and the eventual collapse that comes serves as a visible, measurable marker of the interrogator's success, transforming human suffering into quantifiable data that bureaucracies can record, review, and justify with the clinical detachment of those who remain seated while others stand. And in this transformation lies perhaps the deepest cruelty, that the interrogator's notes will describe the subject's collapse not as evidence of the method's brutality, but as confirmation of its efficacy, as though the body's surrender to physics and biology somehow constitutes a voluntary confession, a willing capitulation rather than the mechanical failure of a system pushed beyond its design tolerances. This conflation of bodily breakdown with truthfulness becomes the final mechanism of the technique's deception. The interrogator need not believe that standing breaks the will, only that it breaks the body enough to produce words, and whether those words reflect reality or merely reflect tea. The false evidence ploy represents one of the most psychologically intricate techniques employed within interrogation rooms across the world, a method so fundamentally dependent upon the human capacity for doubt and vulnerability that it has persisted through centuries of legal evolution and refinement. In practice, an interrogator presents a suspect with fabricated evidence, whether it be a non-existent fingerprint match, a fictional eyewitness statement, a forged laboratory report, or a digitally manipulated photograph, all while maintaining a posture of absolute certainty and professional authority that lends credibility to these invented claims. The suspect finds themselves confronted with what appears to be irrefutable proof of their involvement in a crime, forcing them to reconcile the presented evidence against their own memory of events. a reconciliation that becomes increasingly difficult when the evidence is presented as already existing within official records and investigative files. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique operates on several interconnected levels simultaneously, beginning with the suspect's rational understanding that police investigators would not fabricate evidence outright, that legal systems maintain safeguards against such behavior, and that official documents carry an inherent weight of truth that transcends mere verbal accusation. As the interrogator compounds this presentation with calm, methodical explanations of how the evidence connects to the crime scene, how the forensics align with the theory of guilt, and how the suspect's own story fails to account for these material facts, the suspect experiences a deepening cognitive dissonance that pushes them toward confession as a means of resolving the unbearable gap between what they believe to be true and what they are being told has been objectively proven. The remarkable persistence of the false evidence ploy within modern interrogation practices, particularly within jurisdictions that theoretically prohibit such tactics, reveals a curious acceptance of this method as somehow less egregious than other forms of psychological pressure, perhaps because it operates entirely within the realm of information presentation rather than physical coercion or explicit threats. And yet its documented success rate in extracting false confessions from innocent individuals suggests that we have collectively normalized a practice whose consequences remain profoundly serious and irreversible. The exoneration records of individuals who confessed to crimes they did not commit reveal a pattern in which the false evidence ploy frequently served as the pivotal moment when resistance collapsed, when innocent people accepted a constructed narrative about their own culpability rather than continue defending against what appeared to be incontrovertible proof. Demonstrating how the technique exploits not criminal intent, but rather the ordinary human susceptibility to authority and documentation that most people encounter throughout their lives in contexts where such trust is entirely warranted. The irony becomes particularly acute when we consider that the false evidence ploy succeeds precisely because suspects have been conditioned throughout their lives to respect the very institutions, police departments, forensic laboratories, court systems, that are in that moment deceiving them, making the technique a perverse exploitation of the civic trust that these institutions owe. The interrogator sits across from you in a small, bare room, and they begin by casually mentioning details about your life that you never told them, facts that seem impossibly private, information that creates an immediate sense of exposure and vulnerability. They might reference a conversation you had with someone you trusted, describe where you were on a specific evening, or mention something you purchased, something you searched for online, or a relationship you thought was entirely confidential. The psychological mechanism at work here is profound and operates on multiple levels simultaneously. When a person is confronted with evidence that their private world has been penetrated, that their sense of personal boundaries has been violated, they experience a fundamental shift in their perception of control and safety. The interrogator is not necessarily telling the truth about what they know, but the mere suggestion that comprehensive information exists creates a cognitive framework wherein resistance seems futile. The subject begins to rationalize that if this much is already known, then additional disclosure cannot possibly worsen their situation and might even improve it by demonstrating cooperation. This technique exploits our deeply ingrained assumption that knowledge equals power, that surveillance is total, and that privacy is an illusion we maintain only through denial. What makes this approach particularly insidious is how it mirrors the actual conditions of modern existence, where data collection is ubiquitous, algorithmic monitoring is normalized, and the boundary between public and private has become genuinely porous. We have constructed a world where governments, corporations, and institutions do possess unprecedented access to personal information, making the interrogator's claim feel not like a manipulation, but like a statement of obvious fact. The interrogator leverages this ambient anxiety about surveillance and exposure, transforming it into a tool of compliance. We accept this technique's effectiveness because we have already accepted the underlying premise that true privacy no longer exists, that someone is always watching, and that resistance against the tide of information gathering is ultimately pointless. The interrogation technique merely names what we have come to believe about our contemporary condition, making it feel less like coercion and more like an acknowledgement of reality itself. In this way, the interrogation room becomes less a place of exceptional control and more a microcosm of the information asymmetries that define our ordinary lives, where we are perpetually transparent to institutions while those institutions remain opaque to us, creating a psychological habituation to powerlessness that makes surrender feel not like defeat, but like pragmatism. The interrogator simply makes explicit what the surveillance state keeps implicit, that your choices are already known before you make them, your vulnerabilities already cataloged, your resistance already anticipated and filed away in some database that grows more comprehensive with each passing day. In surrendering to we know all, you are not truly giving up information so much as you are finally aligning your behavior with the reality that has already been constructed around you. The futility technique operates by presenting the subject with a carefully constructed narrative in which resistance, denial, or continued deception is portrayed as entirely pointless, a hopeless endeavor against overwhelming evidence or inevitable conclusions. During interrogation, an investigator might tell a suspect that multiple witnesses have already identified them, that forensic evidence conclusively places them at the scene, that their accomplices have already confessed and provided detailed statements implicating them directly, or that video surveillance has captured their involvement beyond any shadow of doubt. The investigator presents these claims not as questions requiring verification, but as established facts, immutable realities against which any further denial becomes an exercise in futility. The suspect is made to understand that their continued resistance will only worsen their situation, that cooperation at this late stage represents their sole remaining option, that fighting against the tide of evidence serves no purpose except to demonstrate further obstinacy to judges or juries who will ultimately decide their fate. The psychological mechanism underlying this approach rests upon the human tendency to conserve mental and emotional resources when faced with what appears to be an unwinnable situation. When individuals perceive that their actions cannot alter an inevitable outcome, when they believe that continued effort will produce no meaningful change in their circumstances, the motivation to maintain resistance diminishes substantially. The brain, operating on fundamental principles of efficiency, begins to redirect energy away from futile struggle toward adaptation and acceptance. Additionally, the futility technique exploits the psychological phenomenon of learned helplessness, wherein repeated exposure to uncontrollable circumstances produces a state of passive resignation. The subject begins to internalize the narrative presented to them, accepting the investigator's version of events not necessarily because they believe it truthfully, but because maintaining opposition feels psychologically exhausting and logically indefensible. Yet despite the apparent illogic of the technique, it persists across cultures and institutional settings because human psychology remains fundamentally vulnerable to narratives of inevitability and hopelessness, regardless of their actual factual basis. We continue to encounter this mechanism everywhere in modern society, not merely in interrogation rooms but in educational systems, workplace environments, and political discourse, where individuals abandon resistance not because outcomes are genuinely predetermined, but because they have been successfully persuaded that they are. The insidious power of this technique lies in its self-fulfilling prophecy. Once individuals accept the narrative of futility, their subsequent passivity and cooperation appear to validate the investigator's claims retroactively, creating a closed loop wherein the subject's own surrender becomes evidence of their guilt. In this way, the futility technique transforms psychology itself into a weapon that manufactures the very confessions and admissions it purports merely to extract from pre-existing guilt. This recursive logic becomes particularly dangerous when institutional systems, legal, educational, or bureaucratic, are designed in ways that make genuine resistance structurally impossible, rendering the futility narrat. The technique known as Mutt and Jeff, sometimes referred to as the good cop, bad cop routine, involves the deployment of two interrogators who present radically opposing demeanors and approaches to the person being questioned, creating a psychological dynamic where one officer adopts an aggressive, accusatory, and threatening posture, while the other assumes a sympathetic, understanding, and protective role, and through this carefully choreographed contrast, the subject becomes more inclined to cooperate with the officer who appears kinder and more reasonable, viewing that individual as a potential ally against the hostility of the first interrogator. In the real world, this technique manifests when a suspect is brought into an interrogation room where they are first confronted by an aggressive investigator who raises their voice, makes accusations, expresses frustration or anger about the alleged crime, and suggests that the evidence is overwhelming and the case against them is ironclad. And then after a period of psychological pressure, often following a staged exit or break, a second officer enters who treats the subject with apparent kindness, offers them water or coffee, expresses understanding about their difficult situation, and suggests that they might be able to help the suspect if only they would cooperate and tell their side of the story. The psychological mechanism at work here relies upon the principle of contrast and the human tendency toward reciprocal cooperation, because when someone has experienced hostility and threat from one source, they naturally gravitate toward the person offering kindness and support, and this relief provides a powerful motivational force to comply with requests and to share information that might otherwise remain withheld. A phenomenon that exploits our deeply rooted social instinct to align ourselves with those who treat us well and to distance ourselves from those who treat us poorly. What remains remarkable about this technique is its persistent effectiveness despite the fact that most people in modern society are well aware of its existence and can articulate exactly how it functions, yet its prevalence in popular culture, from television shows to films to news reports, has paradoxically normalized it to the point where suspects still fall prey to its logic, even when they consciously understand that both officers are working toward the same goal, and that the kindness of the second officer is not genuine protection, but rather a strategic manipulation designed to extract confession or cooperation. And this disconnect between intellectual understanding and emotional response reveals something fundamental about human nature and our vulnerability to emotional influence even in the face of rational knowledge. The technique ultimately succeeds not because it deceives the intellect, but because it speaks directly to the emotional need for alliance and safety, transforming the interrogation room into a social hierarchy where one must choose a side. And this forced choice between two constructed personas often feels more psychologically real to the suspect than the abstract knowledge that both interrogators serve the same institutional purpose. In this context, the suspect's choice becomes less about rational evaluation of evidence and more about securing an immediate emotional reprieve, which explains why even innocent people sometimes confess under this pressure, having internalized the false premise that cooperate. During an interrogation, particularly one that has stretched across hours with mounting pressure and diminishing resolve, an interrogator will systematically dismantle a subject's sense of self-worth and personal dignity through carefully calibrated humiliation and public degradation. Understanding that a person stripped of their pride becomes far more susceptible to confession, cooperation, and surrender of information they would otherwise protect fiercely. The interrogator might employ tactics such as pointing out inconsistencies in the subject's story while loudly announcing these contradictions to other officers present, or might deliberately mispronounce their name, refuse to use their preferred title, or comment disparagingly on their appearance, family background, or social status, each small indignity accumulating into a corrosive erosion of the psychological barriers that normally protect our sense of autonomous selfhood. The mechanism at work here operates on the fundamental human need for dignity and respect, needs so deeply embedded in our psychological architecture that their systematic denial creates a state of acute distress that often exceeds physical discomfort, because our sense of who we are becomes inextricably linked with how others perceive and treat us, and when that perception is deliberately poisoned and that treatment becomes contemptuous, the mind begins to question the very foundations of its own worth. What makes this technique particularly effective is that most people have invested enormous psychological energy into constructing and maintaining a coherent self-image, a narrative of personal value and respectability that has taken years to build, and watching it crumble under the controlled assault of interrogation creates a kind of psychological vertigo where capitulation begins to feel like the only way to restore some semblance of equilibrium and dignity. Yet despite understanding these mechanisms intellectually, we continue to normalize and perpetuate systems where humiliation and degradation serve as acceptable tools for extracting information, as if the violation of human dignity represents a justified cost for whatever truth might be obtained, when in reality these practices frequently produce unreliable confessions from desperate individuals willing to say anything to restore their damaged sense of self. The tragic irony is that a confession obtained through ego destruction carries the same evidentiary weight as one born from genuine knowledge. Yet studies consistently show that humiliated subjects confabulate details, implicate innocent parties, and construct elaborate false narratives simply to escape the psychological torment of their own diminishment. Transforming an interrogation room into a factory of unreliable testimony where the interrogator's certainty about guilt becomes indistinguishable from the subject's desperation to recover their fractured sense of self. When we examine the historical record of interrogations that relied heavily on ego destruction, from colonial police forces to modern security agencies, we find that the confessions extracted often collapsed under scrutiny, revealing fabrications designed solely to end the psychological assault, while innocent people served sentences for crimes they did not commit, their false confessions standing as monuments to the unreliability of a system that mistakes broken pride for broken resistance. When an interrogator senses that a subject has become defensive or emotionally withdrawn, they will deliberately and strategically elevate the subject's sense of pride and self-importance by offering them opportunities to demonstrate their superiority, intelligence, or unique knowledge, thereby encouraging them to speak more freely in order to showcase these qualities to the interrogator and validate their self-image. The interrogator might compliment the subject's cleverness, suggest that only someone of exceptional capability could have orchestrated a particular situation, or indicate that the interrogator himself is genuinely impressed by the subject's problem-solving abilities or strategic thinking. The subject, who moments before was resistant and guarded, suddenly becomes motivated to elaborate and provide details, not because they have decided to cooperate in the traditional sense, but because their ego has been engaged and flattered, and the opportunity to demonstrate their intellectual prowess or their role in something significant becomes more psychologically rewarding than maintaining silence. This technique works because human beings possess a fundamental psychological need for recognition and esteem, and this need can override other motivations, including self-preservation and loyalty, particularly when a person feels that they have been underestimated or dismissed. The subject begins to rationalize that by explaining their actions and decisions, they are not betraying themselves but rather vindicating themselves, showing the interrogator that they are not the fool or the small player that circumstances might suggest, but rather someone of genuine capability and importance. What makes this technique particularly effective is that it does not feel like coercion at all, and the subject often leaves the interrogation feeling as though they have actually won something or proven something valuable about themselves, even though they have ultimately provided the very information the interrogator sought. We see echoes of this same dynamic in everyday human behavior, where people regularly volunteer personal information, make confessions, or engage in self-disclosure simply because someone has suggested, explicitly or implicitly, that they are special or uniquely capable, demonstrating how deeply this vulnerability to ego-based manipulation runs through the human psychological landscape. A skilled interrogator understands that this mechanism is not limited to criminal suspects or high-stakes scenarios. It operates in boardrooms, classrooms, and intimate relationships wherever someone seeks validation, making it one of the most universally applicable and morally complex tools in the arsenal of persuasion, precisely because it exploits not a weakness or deficiency in human nature, but rather a fundamental and necessary aspect of how we construct and maintain our sense of self. The paradox is that the interrogator need not even be sincere in their admiration. The subject's own need to believe in their importance becomes self-reinforcing, filling in the gaps of doubt and sustaining the narrative of vindication long after the interrogation ends. In this way, ego manipulation achieves what force cannot. It enlists the subject's own psychology as an accomplice in their own disclosure. Fear Up Harsh represents an interrogation approach wherein the questioner deliberately amplifies the subject's anxiety by presenting an exaggerated or falsified account of evidence against them, combined with aggressive verbal confrontation designed to convince the detainee that their situation is far more dire than it actually is. The interrogator might claim that physical evidence conclusively proves guilt, that witnesses have identified them, that co-conspirators have already confessed and implicated them, or that legal consequences will be severe and inescapable, often delivered with raised voice, intense eye contact, and physical proximity intended to create psychological pressure. The mechanism underlying this technique operates on several interconnected psychological principles, beginning with the fundamental human fear response that emerges when we perceive threats to our freedom, safety, or well-being. When someone believes their situation is truly hopeless, and that all evidence points toward their guilt, the rational mind begins seeking escape routes from this psychological trap. And confession or cooperation sometimes appears to be the only available pathway toward reducing immediate distress or gaining some measure of control over their fate. The technique also exploits cognitive biases such as catastrophizing, wherein anxiety naturally amplifies our perception of threat severity and our tendency to trust authority figures who present information with apparent confidence and conviction. What remains striking is how this method persists as a recognized interrogation approach despite substantial research demonstrating that fear-based pressure significantly increases the likelihood of false confessions, particularly among vulnerable populations, including young people whose prefrontal cortex development remains incomplete, individuals with intellectual disabilities or mental health conditions that impair decision-making, and those from marginalized communities with historical reasons to distrust authority. The technique endures in interrogation manuals and training programs because it remains effective at producing confessions in the short term, even when those confessions are demonstrably false, and because interrogators can rationalize its use by accepting the premise that truthful suspects will withstand pressure while guilty ones will break, a comforting but empirically questionable belief that allows institutions to normalize a procedure that has repeatedly resulted in wrongful convictions. The Central Park 5 case exemplifies this danger with particular clarity. 5 teenagers subjected to harsh interrogation confessed to a crime they did not commit, spending years imprisoned before DNA evidence exonerated them. A stark reminder that the technique's psychological efficacy tells us nothing about its reliability as a truth-seeking instrument. Yet the technique persists partly because institutions can point to cases where guilty individuals did confess, treating these successes as validation while systematically discounting the false confessions that emerge through identical methods, a confirmation bias that allows the approach to survive despite its fundamental unreliability as a diagnostic tool for separating truth from fabrication. The regulatory response has been equally telling. While harsh was officially prohibited in U.S. mild represents an interrogation approach that operates in the subtle territory between suggestion and implication, where an interrogator introduces moderate concerns about potential consequences without making explicit threats, allowing the subject's own imagination to fill in the details and amplify the emotional weight of what remains unspoken. In a typical application of this technique, an interrogator might comment casually that the subject's situation is quite serious, that judges tend to look unfavorably on people who do not cooperate, or that other individuals involved in the matter have already begun providing information, thus creating an atmosphere of consequence and potential disadvantage without articulating any specific threat or promise. The psychological mechanism underlying mild exploits the human tendency toward catastrophizing, the natural inclination of a person under stress to imagine worst-case scenarios rather than accepting the ambiguous middle ground, and the fundamental discomfort that emerges when someone possesses incomplete information about matters that could affect their future or well-being. When an interrogator leaves details vague and suggests that things could become considerably worse, the subject's mind involuntarily constructs the most alarming possibilities, often surpassing what the interrogator would have explicitly stated. Thus, the interrogator harnesses the subject's own cognitive processes as a tool for creating psychological pressure. This technique persists in interrogation rooms and investigative settings despite its psychological manipulation, because it operates in a gray zone where direct accusations of threats become difficult to substantiate. The subject cannot definitively prove that anything unlawful was stated, and the appearance of reasonableness is maintained through the absence of overt coercion or explicit consequences. The normalization of mild reflects a broader acceptance of subtle psychological manipulation in institutional settings, a recognition that the mind's interpretation of ambiguous statements can be just as powerful as explicit threats, and an understanding that fear itself, particularly fear of the unknown and the unspoken, represents one of the most effective motivators of human behavior and decision-making. The reliability of confessions obtained through mild remains deeply contested, however, since subjects operating under heightened anxiety and imagination-driven fear are substantially more susceptible to fabricating information, recounting details they believe interrogators wish to hear, or accepting false premises simply to escape the psychological discomfort of uncertainty and ambiguity. Research on false confessions demonstrates that interrogation subjects have subsequently recanted statements made under fear up mild, claiming they agreed to charges or provided fabricated details simply to terminate the interrogation and escape the relentless psychological pressure of imagined consequences, suggesting that the technique's apparent efficiency in generating compliance often conceals a fundamental unreliability in the information obtained and raises serious questions about whether expedient confessions serve justice or merely create the illusion of investigative closure. Fear down is an interrogation technique that operates on a deceptively simple principle. The interrogator begins with an aggressive, intimidating demeanor, presenting themselves as a threatening force capable of inflicting harm, isolation, or severe consequences, and then gradually reduces this intensity by becoming incrementally more sympathetic, reasonable, and understanding as the session progresses. In real interrogation scenarios, an officer might enter a room with raised voice, aggressive body language, hostile accusations, and implicit or explicit threats regarding the suspect's future, their family situation, or their legal standing, creating an environment of genuine psychological pressure and distress. As minutes pass, the interrogator's tone softens, their posture becomes less confrontational. They begin offering understanding comments about the suspect's circumstances, and they present themselves as potentially the only person in the situation who is willing to listen and help. This transition from threat to apparent ally proves psychologically powerful because the human brain craves relief from sustained stress and discomfort, and when that relief finally arrives, it creates a cognitive association between compliance and comfort. The technique exploits our fundamental need for safety and acceptance by making the interrogator's newfound friendliness feel genuinely redemptive after the initial hostility, essentially training the subject's nervous system to associate talking and confession with the cessation of threat and the return to emotional stability. What makes fear down particularly effective despite its transparent mechanics is that even when people understand intellectually how the technique functions, the physiological response remains difficult to override. The body's stress response cannot simply be switched off through conscious knowledge, and so even informed individuals find themselves gravitating toward the sympathetic interrogator after experiencing the aggressive phase. We have normalized this technique across countless police procedurals, films, and television programs, so thoroughly embedding it in our cultural consciousness that many people accept it as a legitimate and standard law enforcement practice without questioning whether creating false threat, extreme stress, and psychological distress represents an ethical investigative method. The technique persists in real interrogation rooms worldwide despite mounting evidence that it produces unreliable confessions and false admissions, because institutions have become accustomed to the immediate results it generates, and because changing established protocols requires systemic acknowledgement of past harms that many organizations resist undertaking. The irony is that jurisdictions implementing evidence-based interrogation methods, those emphasizing rapport building and information gathering over coercion, consistently achieve higher confession rates from guilty parties while simultaneously reducing false confessions. Yet this data struggles to compete with the intuitive appeal of watching someone break under pressure, a narrative so deeply embedded in our understanding of justice that reform feels like weakness rather than sophistication. The persistence of fear down reveals how institutions often prioritize narrative satisfaction, the cathartic image of truth extracted through pressure, over actual investigative efficacy, a preference that transforms a demonstrably inferior tech. During the Second World War, a German officer named Hans Scharff developed an interrogation method that would become one of the most effective and least coercive approaches ever employed. Yet it fundamentally relied on the simple human desire to correct misunderstandings and demonstrate one's own knowledge and competence. Scharff would conduct his interrogations in a manner that appeared almost conversational, often presenting himself as already possessing knowledge about the subject matter while deliberately introducing small factual errors or incomplete information into his discussion. When an interrogated prisoner heard these inaccuracies, something deeply rooted in human psychology would activate, creating an almost irresistible urge to correct the interrogator and provide accurate information instead. The technique worked by appealing to vanity, to the fundamental human need to be understood correctly and to demonstrate expertise, rather than through threats or violence or deprivation. Scharff would establish rapport by showing genuine interest in his subjects as people, by treating them with respect and dignity, by offering them food and comfort, and by creating an environment where the person being interrogated felt valued rather than threatened. The psychological mechanism underlying this approach taps into something so basic about human nature that it operates almost automatically, beneath the level of conscious resistance that a person might otherwise employ to withhold information. When someone believes that an authority figure has misunderstood something about their background, their unit, their superior, or their mission, the desire to set the record straight becomes nearly overwhelming, particularly when the correction allows them to appear knowledgeable and reliable. Yet despite the remarkable effectiveness and ethical superiority of Scharff's method, interrogation practices around the world have historically gravitated toward coercive techniques instead, suggesting that there exists a persistent belief among authorities that causing suffering somehow produces more reliable information, when in fact the opposite is demonstrably true. And perhaps this tendency reveals something troubling about how institutions often prioritize control and dominance over genuine human connection and understanding. The irony is that Scharff himself was vindicated by modern neuroscience, which has since confirmed that stress and fear actually impair memory formation and recall, making coerced confessions not merely unethical but fundamentally unreliable, a fact that suggests the persistence of brutal interrogation owes more to institutional inertia and the illusion of toughness than to any rational assessment of what actually works. Yet Scharff's legacy remains largely confined to academic circles and a handful of enlightened security agencies, while the allure of domination continues to shape interrogation rooms across the globe, a pattern that suggests our institutions have yet to fully internalize what one compassionate German officer understood decades ago, that the path to truth runs not through fear, but through recognition of our shared humanity. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Scharff's work is that effective interrogation is not about breaking someone down, but about creating conditions where they choose to speak truthfully, a principle that extends far beyond the interrogation room into every domain where understanding between humans ma. Planted evidence represents one of the most consequential interrogation techniques, wherein law enforcement officers deliberately introduce false physical items into an investigation to manipulate suspects into confessing. And this practice operates through a deceptively simple but extraordinarily effective psychological mechanism that exploits the human tendency to believe that tangible objects carry inherent truth and authority that cannot be disputed or questioned. When an investigator places a fabricated piece of evidence before a suspect, whether it be a weapon, a document, a photograph, or some other item allegedly recovered from a crime scene, the suspect experiences an immediate cognitive collapse because they recognize that such an object should not exist in connection with the crime. Yet here it stands before them as ostensibly irrefutable proof of their culpability, forcing them into a paradoxical mental space where they must either accept guilt for something they did not do or struggle to explain how this impossible evidence came into existence. The interrogator then skillfully narrates an explanation for the suspect's presence at the scene or involvement in the crime, and because the planted evidence seems to corroborate this narrative, the suspect's resistance begins to crumble as they attempt to reconcile the impossible situation before them, often rationaling that perhaps they committed the crime in a blackout state or that their memory has failed them in some profound way. This technique persists as a standard interrogation tool despite overwhelming evidence that it generates false confessions at alarming rates, and despite the fact that we have developed technologies and procedures specifically designed to prevent such contamination. We continue to normalize it within interrogation rooms across the country, training officers in the subtle art of deception, while accepting that innocent people will inevitably confess to crimes they did not commit. A systemic normalization of fraud that contradicts our fundamental commitment to justice and truth, yet remains embedded within the very institutions tasked with protecting the innocent and holding the guilty accountable. The tragedy deepens when we consider that exonerations based on DNA evidence reveal planted evidence as a recurring factor in wrongful convictions. Yet interrogation manuals continue to teach officers that introducing false evidence is an acceptable method of obtaining truth, creating a fundamental paradox wherein the very mechanisms designed to solve crimes become instruments of injustice, transforming investigative failures into permanent records of innocent lives destroyed. When a suspect finally breaks under the weight of fabricated evidence and confesses to a crime they did not commit, that confession becomes the cornerstone upon which prosecutors build their case, transforming psychological manipulation into legal certainty. And by the time the truth emerges years or decades later, the innocent party has already sacrificed their freedom, their reputation, and their faith in a system that promised them justice but delivered only the institutionalized betrayal of their trust. The most damning aspect of this reality is that we possess the knowledge to stop it. We know planted evidence produces false confessions, we understand the psychological mechanisms at work, and we have alternatives. Yet we continue because the system prioritizes expedience and closure over accuracy. The interrogator arrives with a physical folder, manila or worn, containing documents about the subject being questioned, and this folder becomes the centerpiece of the entire encounter, placed deliberately on the table between them where it can be seen, referenced, and occasionally opened with theatrical precision to suggest that far more is known than perhaps actually exists within those pages. The psychological mechanism at work here is deceptively simple yet remarkably effective, operating on the principle that humans naturally assume authority figures possess complete information, that official documentation represents absolute truth, and that the presence of a file containing one's details constitutes proof of comprehensive surveillance and knowledge. When an interrogator opens this folder and reads a fact that the subject recognizes as true, it creates a credibility bridge that extends to everything else in that folder, regardless of whether those subsequent claims are accurate, outdated, or entirely fabricated, because the mind tends to accept that if some information is correct, then all of it must be reliable. The folder also serves as a physical manifestation of institutional power, suggesting that behind this single interrogator exists an entire apparatus that has been documenting, investigating, and cataloging every detail of the subject's life. And this sense of being known, of having no privacy or secrets, produces a fatigue that makes resistance seem pointless. What persists despite its obvious logical fragility is our nearly involuntary trust in written documentation and official files, our assumption that something printed on paper and filed away must be true, even when we ourselves know how easily such documents can be created, altered, or filled with speculation presented as fact. Interrogators have understood for decades that the folder need not contain anything particularly damaging or even particularly relevant, because the psychological weight of official documentation, combined with the subject's own uncertainty about what investigators might actually know, creates a pressure that often exceeds what the contents themselves could justify. And this remains effective precisely because people continue to grant files and dossiers an almost magical quality of authenticity that transcends their actual informational value. A subject may confess to crimes they didn't commit simply because a folder sits before them, its mere existence suggesting that investigators already possess proof, and this dynamic persists even in modern contexts where digital records have replaced manila folders because the psychological principle remains unchanged. We still defer to the authority that documentation represents, still assume that if something is written down and officially filed, someone in power believes it to be true. And that belief itself becomes a kind of evidence. The file becomes a mirror in which subjects see themselves as the state sees them, not as they understand themselves, and once that distorted reflection is accepted as accurate, resistance collapses into a kind of exhausted compliance, a surrender not to facts, but to the very idea that facts about you exist somewhere beyond your control or knowledge. The interrogator understands that you will fill in the blanks yourself, that your imagination of what might be in those unseen pages will torment you far more effectively than any actual evidence ever could, and so the folder remains. In interrogation rooms around the world, investigators employ a technique so counterintuitive that it seems designed to produce the opposite of truth. They present suspects with fabricated evidence of their guilt, evidence that either does not exist or has been deliberately falsified, offering confession as the only logical escape from the manufactured web of incrimination. A detective might tell a suspect that DNA evidence places them at the crime scene when no such evidence exists, or that a co-conspirator has already implicated them when no such statement was ever made, or that security footage shows them committing the act when the cameras captured nothing at all. The psychological mechanism operates on a principle of hopelessness and desperation. When a suspect is convinced that the evidence against them is overwhelming and irrefutable, they face a choice between maintaining their innocence in the face of what appears to be certain conviction and confession, which the interrogator frames as the more rational path forward, promising leniency or understanding in exchange for accepting responsibility. The interrogator creates a false equivalence where confessing becomes not an admission of guilt, but rather a pragmatic response to an impossible situation, a way to regain some agency in a system that otherwise seems designed to crush them completely. What makes this technique particularly insidious is that innocent people, confronted with the apparent certainty of false evidence and the suggestion that confessing might lead to a better outcome, sometimes choose to confess to crimes they did not commit, fundamentally accepting the interrogator's constructed reality as more authentic than their own memory and experience. Despite decades of research demonstrating that false confessions occur with disturbing frequency and that they lead to wrongful convictions, the practice persists in interrogation protocols across numerous jurisdictions, operating under the assumption that truly innocent people will never abandon their claim to innocence regardless of the pressure applied, an assumption that has been proven wrong repeatedly in cases of exoneration through DNA evidence and other conclusive proof. Yet remains embedded in the training and standard operating procedures of law enforcement agencies worldwide. The paradox deepens when we recognize that the very interrogation techniques designed to elicit truth, the presentation of false evidence, the suggestion of inevitability, the offer of mercy for cooperation, are the same mechanisms that systematically transform innocent suspects into confessors, creating a system where the confession itself becomes both the investigator's validation and the defendant's condemnation, regardless of actual culpability. The Central Park Five, the Norfolk Four, and countless others whose convictions were vacated stand as monuments to this machinery of coerced confession, their exonerations arriving years or decades too late to restore what was taken, while the interrogators who extracted false admissions often face no professional consequences, allowing the technique to perpetuate unchallenged within systems that have already invested their authority in the confession's validity. The result is a criminal justice system that has institutionalized a contradiction. It demands confessions as proof of guilt while simultaneously employing methods scientifically proven to manufacture false ones, creating a self-perpetuating C. During an interrogation, the detective sits across from the suspect and begins to reframe the severity of the alleged crime in subtle but profoundly persuasive ways, suggesting that what happened was not as terrible as it might initially appear, that circumstances were extenuating, that the suspect's intentions were understandable even if the actions were regrettable, and that compared to other crimes or other criminals. This particular offense exists on a spectrum of human behavior that falls well within the range of comprehensible motivations rather than pure malice. The detective might say something like the victim probably provoked you, or you were just trying to protect yourself, or this was not premeditated like you thought it was, thereby systematically reducing the moral weight and legal gravity of the alleged act in the suspect's mind, making it easier for that person to confess, because they have begun to believe that their actions, while wrong, were not as fundamentally evil or damaging as they initially feared. The psychological mechanism at work here is quite elegant in its simplicity. Humans are remarkably skilled at rationalizing their own behavior when someone in a position of apparent authority or expertise offers them a narrative framework that makes their actions seem more understandable, more forgivable, more aligned with normal human impulses rather than aberrant pathology. When the detective suggests that the crime was a mistake rather than a character flaw, that it was a momentary lapse rather than a reflection of who the suspect truly is, the suspect's defenses begin to crumble because they are being offered a way to preserve their self-image while still admitting to what they did. What is perhaps most striking about minimization as a technique is how it operates in the broader context of human discourse and persuasion, where we constantly encounter people and institutions attempting to downplay the severity of problems, mistakes, or harmful actions by contextualizing them, by comparing them to worse alternatives, by suggesting that they are not really as bad as they seem when you consider all the factors involved. And we have collectively become so accustomed to this rhetorical strategy that we rarely notice, when we are being led toward acceptance of things, we might otherwise find unacceptable. We see this mechanism at work when corporations dismiss environmental violations as isolated incidents, when institutions minimize abuse scandals by framing them as regrettable but isolated lapses in judgment, when political figures contextualize inflammatory rhetoric as taken out of context or misunderstood, and we find ourselves nodding along because the reframing feels reasonable, feels human, feels like a fair assessment. Until we step back and realize that something genuinely serious has been quietly transformed into something manageable, something forgivable, something that requires no meaningful accountability or change. And yet the most insidious aspect of minimization is that it often contains kernels of truth. Circumstances are sometimes extenuating, context does matter, and moral complexity is real, which makes the technique devastatingly effective because it exploits our legitimate understanding that reality is nuanced, weaponizing our own capacity for fairness against our ability to recognize genuine harm. Imagine a detective sitting across from a suspect in a small, windowless room, and the detective begins to describe not just the crime that was committed, but an exaggerated version of it, layering on additional charges, suggesting connections to other crimes, implying that cooperating witnesses have already provided damning testimony, and painting a picture so severe that the suspect's alleged involvement seems almost inevitable and inescapable. This technique, known as maximization, operates on a simple but profound psychological principle. When a person perceives the consequences of their situation to be at their absolute worst, they may paradoxically become more willing to confess, cooperate, or provide information, because any admission or negotiation feels like it might reduce the overwhelming weight of what they're facing. The detective is essentially creating a psychological trap where silence or denial appears infinitely more costly than confession, even when the actual evidence may be far less substantial than the theatrical presentation suggests. The mechanism works because human beings are loss-averse creatures who will sometimes accept a certain loss if it means avoiding a potentially greater one. And when confronted with a maximized threat scenario, the suspect's mind begins calculating whether admitting to something lesser might actually be their best available option. What makes this technique particularly insidious is that it can operate entirely through suggestion and implication rather than explicit threats, creating a sense of doom through narrative construction alone. A detective might say things like, "Everyone in your situation eventually talks, and the ones who cooperate early always get better deals," or describe how witnesses have supposedly placed the suspect at the scene, or detail how the forensic evidence is stacking up, all while exaggerating, misrepresenting, or outright fabricating these details to maximize the perceived jeopardy. The suspect's rational mind knows that silence might be the legally sound choice, yet the emotional and psychological response to maximization can overwhelm logical thinking, particularly when combined with fatigue, stress, isolation, and the inherent power imbalance of the interrogation environment. Remarkably, maximization persists as a legitimate interrogation strategy in many jurisdictions despite substantial research demonstrating that it significantly increases the risk of false confessions, particularly among vulnerable populations like juveniles, individuals with intellectual disabilities, or those with mental health conditions who may be especially susceptible to accepting the maximized narrative as truth. We have normalized this technique through decades of crime television programming that portrays it as clever detective work, through interrogation training that teaches it as standard protocol, and through a legal system that has been slow to recognize the psychological coercion inherent in such tactics, even though the mechanism by which it operates is fundamentally about distorting perception and manipulating emotional response rather than pursuing objective truth. The irony is that a confession obtained through maximization, where a frightened person admits to something they may not have done simply to escape the psychological pressure, can then be used as evidence of guilt, creating a false certainty that closes off further investigation and allows actual perpetrators to remain. During prolonged interrogation, interrogators often establish a central narrative or theme that they repeatedly return to throughout questioning, building upon it incrementally with each cycle of conversation, much like a musician developing a motif through variations and elaborations that gradually transform the listener's perception of its meaning and significance. The interrogator begins by introducing a simple interpretive framework, perhaps suggesting that the subject acted out of desperation rather than malice, or that circumstances beyond their control compelled their actions, and then methodically weaves this theme through subsequent questions, each time adding new details, new contexts, new reasons that seem to reinforce this central narrative until the subject begins to inhabit this story as though it were their own lived experience rather than an external construction. The psychological mechanism underlying theme development operates on the principle that human beings are fundamentally narrative creatures who seek coherence and meaning in their experiences. And when an interrogator provides a compelling, emotionally resonant story that explains confusing or contradictory behaviors, the subject's mind naturally gravitates toward accepting this framework because it offers relief from cognitive dissonance and provides a satisfying explanation for actions they themselves may be struggling to understand. The brain's preference for narrative closure is so profound that even when the proposed theme contradicts the subject's own memories, repeated exposure to the theme, combined with the authority of the interrogator and the exhausting conditions of interrogation, can gradually erode the subject's confidence in their own recollection and replace it with the interrogator's version of events. What makes theme development particularly insidious is how seamlessly it masquerades as genuine empathy and understanding, allowing interrogators to position themselves as allies who comprehend the subject's true motivations better than the subject themselves can. And this perception of alliance, built through careful repetition and sympathetic reframing, becomes a powerful tool for extracting confessions and cooperation that might otherwise never occur. Despite decades of research demonstrating that confessions obtained through theme development often contain significant fabrications and false details, many interrogation systems continue to employ these techniques as standard practice, relying on the assumption that truth will eventually emerge from a sustained narrative approach. Even though the psychological evidence suggests instead that theme development primarily succeeds in creating false memories and securing false confessions rather than uncovering genuine truths. The irony is particularly acute in cases where subjects ultimately internalize these fabricated narratives so thoroughly that they become unable to distinguish between implanted memories and genuine recollection, leading to convictions based on confessions that the confessor themselves now sincerely believes, yet which have no basis in actual events. This phenomenon, where the interrogation technique succeeds so completely that it erases the very distinction between truth and constructed narrative, represents perhaps the most troubling outcome of theme development, as it transforms the subject from a potential source of reliable information into an unreliable narrator of their own life. The alternative question represents one of the most subtle and psychologically elegant techniques employed in interrogation rooms across the world, a method that operates by presenting a suspect with what appears to be a choice between two distinct options, when in reality, both options serve to advance the interrogator's investigative agenda in fundamentally the same direction. In a typical application of this technique, an interrogator might ask a suspect not whether they were present at a crime scene, but rather whether they arrived at the location in the morning or in the afternoon, or they might not ask if a suspect knew the victim, but instead whether they had known them for 5 years or for 10 years, thereby embedding an assumption of guilt or involvement within the grammatical structure of the question itself. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique operates on several layers simultaneously, beginning with what researchers call the illusion of choice, which satisfies a deep human need to feel agency and control over one's circumstances, making suspects more likely to answer when they believe they are selecting between genuine alternatives rather than simply confessing to allegations. When a person is presented with two options, the mind naturally brackets the question itself and focuses instead on distinguishing between the options presented, a cognitive process that effectively bypasses the more fundamental question of whether either option should be accepted at all. And this redirection of attention is precisely what makes the technique so effective in eliciting responses that might otherwise be withheld. Furthermore, the alternative question exploits what psychologists call presupposition, the hidden assumptions embedded within language itself, because both options presuppose an underlying fact that has not been established, whether that fact is presence at a location, knowledge of a person, or participation in an event, and by forcing the suspect to choose between the options, the interrogator secures an implicit acknowledgement of the presupposed fact regardless of which alternative the suspect selects. The technique persists as a standard tool in interrogation manuals and training programs because it produces results. Because suspects often do answer the question by selecting one of the presented alternatives, and because this answer, once given, can later be reframed and amplified into a fuller confession or admission of guilt. Yet what remains remarkable is how frequently this technique succeeds despite its fundamental logical transparency. How it continues to function effectively even when suspects are aware of its basic structure, suggesting that the human mind under stress and uncertainty defaults toward compliance and cooperation even when the rational mind recognizes the manipulation at work. This paradox reveals a deeper truth about interrogation, that the technique's power lies not primarily in its logical structure, but in the interrogator's exploitation of the suspect's psychological state, exhaustion, fear, isolation, and the desperate hope that cooperation might lead to leniency, conditions under which even intelligent, educated suspects find themselves unable to resist the gravitational pull toward choosing between options rather than rejecting the frame entirely. Imagine an interrogator sitting across from a suspect in a windowless room, and instead of asking whether the suspect committed the crime, the interrogator leans forward and asks, "When you entered the building that night, did you use the front door or the back entrance?" The question itself contains an embedded assumption that the suspect was indeed present at the building, removing the possibility of a simple denial and forcing the subject into a cognitive position where they must either accept the premise or engage in explicit contradiction. This technique, known as the Assumptive Question, operates by presupposing certain facts as already established within the very structure of the inquiry itself, and in doing so, it creates a linguistic trap where answering either option presented seems to confirm the underlying assumption. The psychology behind this approach is rooted in something called the false premise effect, wherein our brains tend to process and accept the foundational assumptions embedded in questions before we consciously evaluate whether those assumptions are actually true. When someone hears a question framed this way, the cognitive load of processing the question's surface meaning often outpaces our ability to mentally step back and challenge the hidden premise, and we find ourselves answering as though the assumed facts were already established truth. The interrogator exploits this natural cognitive tendency by constructing questions that slide assumptions past our conscious resistance, making it feel more natural and less effortful to simply choose between the options presented rather than to reject the entire framework of the question. What makes this technique particularly persistent in human interaction is that it operates beneath the threshold of conscious awareness for most people, functioning in everyday conversation between friends, family members, and colleagues without anyone explicitly recognizing it as a manipulative structure. We encounter assumptive questions constantly in sales contexts, in political discourse, in casual social situations, and in family arguments where the person asking has learned, often intuitively rather than deliberately, that embedding assumptions into questions is far more effective at steering responses than simply asking direct questions and accepting direct answers. The normalization of this technique across so many domains of human communication means that most people have internalized both its use and its effects without ever developing explicit resistance to it, and we continue to be guided by assumptive questions throughout our lives, answering them as though their premises were already settled facts requiring no examination. The power of this technique lies precisely in its invisibility, a parent asking a teenager, "What time will you be home tonight?" rather than "Are you going out?" has already secured acceptance of the outing itself, and by the time the teenager realizes the assumption has been made, they are already negotiating its terms rather than its legitimacy. In this way, assumptive questions function as a kind of social aikido, using the momentum of our own cognitive processes against us, turning our natural desire to be cooperative and efficient into a mechanism for our own subtle persuasion. Timeline reversal is an interrogation technique wherein the investigator presents events to the subject in reverse chronological order, starting from the known conclusion and working deliberately backward through the sequence of what supposedly occurred, which fundamentally disorients the subject's natural narrative construction and forces the mind to reconstruct memory in an unfamiliar direction that bypasses the automatic storytelling patterns we rely upon to maintain consistency and coherence in our recollections. In real-world interrogation settings, an investigator might begin by stating the final known fact, such as an object being discovered at a specific location at a particular time, and then ask the subject to explain how it arrived there by working backward through the preceding hours or days, requiring the subject to trace causality in reverse rather than the forward direction in which events naturally unfold, and which our brains are evolutionarily designed to process and remember. This technique exploits a fundamental neurological vulnerability because human memory is inherently organized chronologically through the process of how we encode experiences, with each moment building upon the previous moment in a forward temporal sequence that feels intuitive and natural to us. When forced to reverse this process, the brain must work against its own organizational structure, consuming significantly more cognitive resources and creating measurable stress responses that manifest as hesitation, contradiction, and fabrication as the subject struggles to reconstruct events in an alien direction. The psychological mechanism underlying timeline reversal rests on the principle that deception typically requires the deceiver to maintain a consistent forward narrative, and reversing that narrative's direction introduces a novel cognitive burden that exceeds what most people can manage while simultaneously maintaining false information or withholding truth. The effort becomes so taxing that inconsistencies emerge almost involuntarily, and truthful individuals, while initially confused, eventually align their reversed narrative with their actual forward memories, whereas those fabricating stories find the reversal nearly impossible to sustain coherently. Yet despite the obvious logical vulnerabilities it exposes in false narratives, timeline reversal remains a technique that we have somewhat normalized within interrogation protocols, treating it as simply another tool among many rather than acknowledging the profound disorientation it creates in human consciousness. And we continue to employ it even as neuroscience increasingly demonstrates how it destabilizes the very cognitive faculties required for reliable communication and truthful expression. The irony is particularly acute when we consider that an interrogation technique designed to expose deception may simultaneously impair the neurological processes necessary for a suspect to articulate truth, creating a scenario where both the guilty and innocent become equally unreliable narrators, their responses shaped more by cognitive overwhelm than by the actual events in question. This paradox suggests that timeline reversal may ultimately tell us more about the fragility of human memory itself than about the truthfulness of any individual subject, transforming an interrogation room into a demonstration of how easily our minds can be made to doubt their own basic chronological architecture. The cognitive interview represents a fundamentally different approach to witness interrogation, one that emerged from cognitive psychology research in the 1980s and has since become a cornerstone of modern investigative interviewing across law enforcement agencies worldwide. Rather than employing confrontational tactics or manipulative questioning strategies, the cognitive interview operates on the principle that human memory functions best when accessed through a comprehensive and methodical reconstruction of contextual details, environmental factors, and sensory experiences surrounding the event in question. The interviewer guides the witness through a carefully structured process that begins with establishing rapport and creating a safe, non-threatening environment, then progresses through systematic questioning that encourages the witness to mentally return to the scene, to visualize spatial relationships between objects and people, to recall conversations in their original sequence, and to access not just visual information but also sounds, smells, emotions, and physical sensations that were present during the witnessed event. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique rests on the understanding that memory is not a simple recording device, but rather a complex network of interconnected associations, where one sensory detail can unlock another, where environmental context provides retrieval cues, and where the act of consciously reconstructing the entire experiential landscape activates multiple neural pathways that might otherwise remain dormant. The cognitive interview acknowledges that witnesses often possess far more information than they initially realize they possess, and that the problem is not one of deficient memory, but rather of inefficient retrieval, making the interviewer's role fundamentally one of providing the right retrieval cues rather than one of pressuring or deceiving the witness into confession. Despite the extensive research supporting its effectiveness and its superiority to more aggressive interrogation methods, the cognitive interview has never achieved the cultural dominance or widespread adoption that one might expect from an empirically superior technique, possibly because its slower pace, its emphasis on witness comfort, and its rejection of psychological manipulation run counter to the instinctive desire for quick results that often characterizes criminal investigations. Yet it persists as an increasingly recognized gold standard precisely because it functions with integrity rather than against it. When properly implemented, the cognitive interview has consistently demonstrated superior recall rates compared to conventional questioning methods, with studies showing witnesses produce significantly more accurate details and fewer false memories, a testament to the principle that respecting the witness's cognitive processes ultimately serves the investigation more effectively than attempting to circumvent them. The technique's power lies equally in its humility, in recognizing that the investigator is not the architect of truth, but rather a facilitator of the witness's own memory recovery. And this philosophical stance transforms the entire dynamic of the interview from an adversarial extraction into a collaborative reconstruction, where both parties are united in the pursuit of accuracy rather than divided by competing agendas. The confrontation method represents one of the most direct and psychologically intense interrogation techniques, wherein an investigator presents a suspect with evidence, real or fabricated, that directly contradicts their established narrative, forcing them into an immediate state of cognitive dissonance and defensive response. In a typical scenario, an interrogator might lay photographs on an interrogation table, play audio recordings, or present witness statements that seemingly prove the suspect's guilt or expose their lies, all while maintaining unwavering eye contact and allowing uncomfortable silence to fill the space between accusation and response. The suspect, suddenly confronted with what appears to be irrefutable proof of their culpability, experiences a profound psychological shift wherein their carefully constructed story begins to crumble, their physiological responses accelerate, and their mental state transitions from attempted control to reactive panic. The mechanism behind this technique operates on several psychological principles simultaneously. The shock of unexpected contradiction disrupts the suspect's ability to maintain composure. The apparent inevitability of exposure triggers a fight-or-flight response that overwhelms rational deliberation, and the social pressure of direct accusation activates deep-seated fears about judgment and condemnation that have evolved within human consciousness over millennia. The interrogator's calm demeanor, in contrast to the suspect's escalating distress, creates a power asymmetry that reinforces the perception that resistance is futile, that honesty might be the only remaining pathway toward any semblance of mercy or understanding. What remains peculiar about this technique is how it persists across cultures and legal systems despite substantial psychological research demonstrating that heightened emotional states and cognitive overload frequently produce false confessions, fabricated memories, and deeply unreliable testimony that can permanently damage the pursuit of actual justice. Yet interrogation rooms worldwide continue to employ confrontation strategies, suggesting that institutions have normalized this approach not because it reliably produces truth, but because it reliably produces confessions, regardless of their accuracy or validity, fulfilling a deep human need for closure and resolution that supersedes the need for genuine accountability or understanding. The paradox deepens when one considers that many exonerations of wrongfully convicted individuals reveal confrontation-induced confessions as the primary evidence that secured their initial convictions. Yet this cyclical failure has generated minimal systemic reform, suggesting that the psychological satisfaction of apparent resolution has become institutionally more valuable than the empirical pursuit of actual guilt or innocence. This institutional preference for confessional closure over evidential truth manifests most starkly in cases where DNA evidence later exonerates individuals who confessed under confrontational pressure. Yet interrogation protocols remain virtually unchanged, revealing how deeply embedded the satisfaction of confession has become within law enforcement culture and prosecutorial incentive structures. The confrontation method persists not as a tool refined by evidence, but as a ritualistic performance that transforms the burden of proof into a burden of resistance, asking suspects to maintain their. The contradiction technique represents one of the most psychologically elegant methods employed within interrogation rooms across countless jurisdictions, operating on the fundamental principle that human beings experience profound discomfort when confronted with inconsistencies between their stated positions and the evidence arrayed against them. An investigator will methodically present a suspect with two pieces of information that directly contradict one another, such as claiming that surveillance footage places the individual at a specific location, while simultaneously presenting testimony from witnesses that positions them elsewhere entirely. And then the interrogator will sit in deliberate silence, allowing the cognitive dissonance to accumulate within the suspect's mind like pressure building behind a sealed door. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique draws from cognitive dissonance theory, which suggests that human beings possess an innate drive to maintain internal consistency in their beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. And when this consistency is shattered through the presentation of conflicting information, the individual experiences genuine psychological distress that compels them toward resolution, often through confession or clarification that the interrogator can then exploit. The suspect finds themselves in an impossible cognitive position where they must choose between accepting one contradiction or the other, and in their desperate attempt to restore equilibrium to their own sense of reality, they frequently begin to provide additional information, to revise their previous statements, or to engage in increasingly elaborate explanations designed to reconcile what appears to be irreconcilable. What remains curious is how thoroughly normalized this technique has become within investigative procedure, despite the substantial body of research demonstrating that stress and cognitive dissonance can lead to false confessions, implanted memories, and statements that bear no relationship whatsoever to actual events. Yet interrogators continue to employ it with confidence, assured of its effectiveness at generating talking, if not necessarily truth. The paradox deepens when one considers that an innocent person experiencing genuine confusion about contradictory evidence may fabricate details simply to escape the psychological torment of the interrogation, inadvertently constructing a confession that perfectly matches the investigator's theory while bearing no resemblance to what actually occurred. In this way, the contradiction technique becomes not a reliable instrument of justice, but rather a sophisticated mechanism for producing narratives that satisfy the interrogator's need for resolution, regardless of their correspondence to truth. This phenomenon finds particular resonance in cases where exonerating DNA evidence later contradicts confessions obtained through such techniques, revealing that individuals had willingly constructed elaborate false narratives simply to terminate the unbearable psychological pressure of the interrogation itself, transforming what was meant to be a truth-seeking mechanism into an apparatus that manufactures its own convenient fictions. The tragedy lies not merely in wrongful convictions, but in the erosion of investigative integrity itself. When a technique designed to expose deception becomes the primary architect of it, the entire edifice of interrogation-based justice collapses into. The interrogator asks the same question again, and then again, each time with minimal variation in phrasing or delivery, creating a cyclical pattern that seems to have no endpoint, no destination, only the endless return to the same inquiry spoken in nearly identical ways. The subject answers the first time with clarity and conviction, but as the question repeats for the third time, then the fifth, then the 10th, something begins to shift in their mental landscape, a subtle erosion of certainty that accumulates with each iteration. The interrogator demonstrates no frustration, no impatience, no indication that the repeated question is anything unusual or remarkable, simply asking it again as though for the first time, with the same measured tone and the same deliberate cadence. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique operates on the principle that human memory and confidence are not fixed quantities, but rather fluid states that degrade when repeatedly challenged without acknowledgement of their validity. When a person provides an answer and it is simply ignored, the question returning unchanged, the mind begins to interpret this silence not as acceptance but as implicit rejection, as though the answer itself contained some flaw or insufficiency that the questioner has detected but not articulated. After sufficient repetitions, the subject may begin to doubt their own recollection of events, may wonder if they misunderstood something fundamental about what occurred, may start to reconstruct their narrative in an attempt to discover what the interrogator apparently already knows but will not share. The remarkable aspect of this technique is how readily it persists despite having virtually no logical foundation, for there is no rational reason why repeating a question should make an answer more truthful or more complete, and yet the repetition itself becomes a form of pressure that requires no explicit threats or accusations to generate psychological discomfort. We have normalized this pattern so thoroughly in ordinary conversation that it passes nearly undetectable, present in parental questioning of children who resist bedtime, in workplace inquiries about missed deadlines, in the gentle persistence of loved ones asking about our well-being when we claim to be fine, each instance a small version of the same loop that never truly breaks. The loop's true power lies in its invisibility. We experience it as natural inquiry rather than coercion, which means we internalize the doubt it generates as our own uncertainty rather than recognizing it as something imposed upon us, making it perhaps the most insidious interrogation technique because it requires our own minds to complete the work of persuasion against ourselves. And in this self-inflicted doubt lies a paradox. The subject becomes simultaneously more compliant and more unreliable, willing to agree to almost anything if it might finally satisfy the question, to construct false memories or confess to things they did not do, simply to escape the loop by giving the interrogator what seems to be demanded, which means the technique succeeds not by extracting truth, but by manufacturing consent through psychological exhaustion. This erosion of reliability is precisely what makes the technique so dangerous in contexts where truth-seeking is supposedly the goal. The interrogator obtains statements that feel like confessions but are merely capitulations, answers shaped by fatigue rather than accurate. Picture an interrogation room where a detective sits across from a suspect, and as the questioning intensifies, the officer begins to magnify certain details far beyond their actual significance, stretching the truth until it becomes something almost unrecognizable from reality. The detective might claim that evidence found at the scene is far more damning than it actually is, or suggest that witness testimony is far more corroborating than the facts genuinely support, or describe the suspect's involvement in terms so dramatically inflated that the actual crime seems almost trivial by comparison. What the interrogator is doing is taking kernels of truth and expanding them into enormous, looming obstacles that the suspect cannot possibly ignore or dismiss, transforming ambiguous details into seemingly concrete proof of guilt through sheer rhetorical amplification. The mechanism at work here operates on a psychological principle that humans are naturally more responsive to extreme statements than to measured ones, and that when something is presented with sufficient intensity and confidence, the mind begins to accept the exaggeration as closer to reality than the original fact, especially when the person under interrogation is already stressed, fatigued, and psychologically vulnerable. The suspect, hearing these magnified claims, begins to wonder whether perhaps the situation really is as dire as being described, whether maybe they have somehow forgotten crucial details that would confirm the exaggerated narrative, and whether their own memory might be unreliable compared to the confident assertions of the authority figure questioning them. Despite the fundamental logical flaw at the heart of exaggeration, the fact that inflating a fact does not actually make it more true, but merely makes it a lie wrapped in theatrical presentation. This technique persists within interrogation methodology because it repeatedly produces results, because our species has somehow normalized the idea that intensity of expression correlates with accuracy of information. And because we have created institutional structures where authority figures are often granted the benefit of the doubt when they present extreme claims with unwavering confidence. Yet the cost of this acceptance is profound. Innocent people confess to crimes they did not commit. Guilty parties exploit the public's familiarity with exaggeration to dismiss legitimate evidence as mere theatrical amplification. And the collective trust in institutions erodes when citizens recognize that the gap between stated reality and actual reality has become so wide that distinguishing truth from performance requires constant skepticism. This erosion of trust becomes self-perpetuating. As people grow more skeptical of official narratives, they become equally susceptible to exaggerated claims from alternative sources, trading one inflated version of reality for another, until the very concept of an objective fact seems quaint and impossibly naive. In this landscape of competing exaggerations, the original truth, however mundane or complicated, becomes almost irretrievable, buried beneath layers of theatrical amplification from every direction. And so the interrogation room becomes a microcosm of the larger culture, a space where the exaggerated claim has become the default currency of persuasion, where nuance is mistaken for weakness, and where the person who can inflate their narrative most convincingly often prevails, regardless. The interrogator begins by establishing a framework of moral culpability, presenting the suspect with a scenario in which their actions, while perhaps regrettable, appear less severe when contextualized within a broader narrative of circumstances and pressures. And through the careful repetition of this reframed narrative, the suspect gradually begins to internalize a version of events in which their guilt diminishes with each retelling, each clarification. Each small concession that the interrogator acknowledges and accepts without judgment. In real interrogation rooms across the world, this technique manifests when a detective might say something like, "Well, anyone in your position might have done the same thing, or we understand that you were under considerable pressure, or clearly you didn't intend for this to happen the way it did," and with these small validations. The psychological burden that initially felt crushing begins to fracture and distribute itself across so many extenuating factors that the suspect's sense of personal responsibility transforms into something more diffuse and manageable. The mechanism operates on a fundamental principle of human psychology. Guilt is not a static emotional state, but rather a negotiable perception that can be subtly redirected through the strategic introduction of competing narratives and the gradual normalization of alternative interpretations of one's own actions. When a person is made to feel that their circumstances were exceptional, that reasonable people would have struggled in their position, that the outcome was partially determined by factors beyond their control, the brain accepts these framings as legitimate modifications to the original guilt calculus, and the emotional weight that once felt unbearable begins to distribute across multiple explanatory factors rather than concentrating solely on personal volition and choice. What makes this technique particularly insidious in the context of interrogation is that it does not require the suspect to believe they are completely innocent. Rather, it requires only that they accept a modestly diminished version of their guilt, which then becomes easier to confess to because it feels proportionate and almost reasonable. And once that first confession is made with reduced guilt attached to it, the interrogator can then work to further diminish it or redirect it toward different motivations entirely. The remarkable persistence of this technique, despite its logical transparency, suggests something profound about human nature. We desperately want to believe that our actions were somewhat justified, that the circumstances genuinely mattered, that we are not fundamentally bad people, and we will accept almost any plausible narrative that allows us to maintain a functioning sense of self-worth, even when that narrative involves active participation in wrongdoing, because living with total, unmitigated guilt is a psychological burden that most people will move mountains to escape from or at least reduce. This is precisely why the technique proves so effective across cultures and contexts. It doesn't ask a suspect to suddenly see themselves as innocent, but rather offers them a psychologically sustainable middle ground where they can confess, cooperate, and even feel a measure of relief, because they have reframed their actions as understandable responses to impossible circumstances rather than as expressions of their true moral character. Shifting blame represents one of the most pervasive and deeply ingrained defensive mechanisms observed in human interactions, particularly during moments of conflict, accusation, or when facing consequences for one's own actions. In a typical interrogation scenario, an investigator might present evidence of wrongdoing to a suspect, and rather than addressing that evidence directly or accepting responsibility, the suspect redirects the focus entirely onto another person, circumstances beyond their control, or systemic factors that supposedly contributed to or caused the situation. For instance, when confronted about a theft, a suspect might claim that they were merely following orders from someone else, or that economic hardship forced them into the situation, or that they were simply taking advantage of a system that everyone else was already exploiting. The interrogator observes how quickly the conversation shifts from the suspect's actions to a narrative centered on external causes, accomplices, or mitigating factors that ostensibly remove or significantly diminish personal culpability. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique operates on several interconnected levels that reveal fundamental aspects of how humans protect their self-image and emotional stability. When faced with irrefutable evidence of wrongdoing, the human mind experiences acute cognitive dissonance between one's self-perception as a good person and the reality of having committed a harmful act. Rather than integrating this contradiction through genuine introspection and acceptance of responsibility, the mind employs a sophisticated filtering system that redirects blame outward, thereby preserving the individual's core sense of identity and self-worth. This is not typically a conscious or deliberate deception in the moment, but rather an automatic protective response that feels entirely reasonable and justified from the perspective of the person engaging in it. The mechanism persists with remarkable tenacity in modern society despite its logical fragility and the fact that most people intellectually recognize its unreasonableness when others employ it. We continue to accept blame shifting as a normal aspect of human discourse, often tacitly endorsing it through our failure to consistently hold people accountable for their rationalizations. Parents witness it in their children and sometimes accept partial blame for their offspring's misbehavior. Workplaces accommodate it through conversations that become muddied by competing narratives about responsibility rather than clear acknowledgement of actions. Media and public discourse normalize it constantly as public figures engage in elaborate blame shifting that their supporters and detractors alike seem to expect and even accept as standard political and social theater. The technique persists because it offers immediate psychological relief, and because calling it out directly often escalates conflict rather than resolving it, creating a strange equilibrium where everyone recognizes blame shifting as both logically indefensible and pragmatically unavoidable in daily human relations. In interrogation settings, skilled investigators recognize this equilibrium and deliberately exploit it by presenting blame shifting not as a moral failing but as a rational choice, thereby validating the suspect's defensive narrative while simultaneously extracting admissions that, once spoken aloud and documented, become difficult to retract. In interrogation rooms around the world, a suspect sits across from an investigator with nothing but time and anxiety, their eyes drawn repeatedly to the clock on the wall, watching the minutes accumulate with an almost gravitational pull that seems to intensify their discomfort with each passing second. The suspect's gaze drifts to the clock face perhaps once every 30 seconds, then every 20, then every 10, until the act of checking the time becomes more frequent than any actual conversation, and they begin to wonder whether the clock is moving slower than it should, whether time itself has been distorted by the weight of their circumstances. The interrogator remains aware of this behavior, understanding that the suspect's fixation on the clock represents a profound psychological disturbance, a fracturing of their normal temporal experience where minutes feel like hours and the future seems to stretch endlessly forward. This mechanism operates through a well-documented psychological phenomenon wherein subjective time perception becomes dramatically altered under stress and uncertainty, as the brain's attention narrows intensely on the passage of time itself, making awareness of duration hyperconscious and therefore subjectively longer. When we focus deliberately on time passing, when we watch for it and anticipate it, we create a feedback loop where each observation reinforces the next, and the mind constructs a subjective experience that deviates sharply from objective chronological reality. What remains remarkable is how pervasive this experience has become in modern society, extending far beyond interrogation rooms into classrooms and waiting rooms and workplaces, where the clock remains a permanent fixture of our institutional spaces, perpetually available for our anxious observation. We have normalized the existence of clocks everywhere, providing constant access to temporal measurement, and yet we rarely question how this availability trains us to become clock watchers, to fragment our attention between the present moment and the numerical representation of its passage, creating a sort of low-level temporal anxiety that we simply accept as an unremarkable part of contemporary existence. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of this arrangement is that we have internalized the clock's presence so thoroughly that we experience time anxiety even in moments when no clock is visible. The phantom ticking persists in our minds, a temporal specter that haunts our consciousness long after we've stopped actively watching, transforming our relationship with duration itself into something perpetually monitored and perpetually insufficient. We find ourselves perpetually behind schedule, not because time actually moves faster than before, but because our awareness of its passage has been sharpened to an almost painful degree, making us hyper-aware of every moment slipping away before we've adequately used it. In this sense, the clock has become less a tool for measuring time and more a mirror reflecting our deep anxiety about scarcity, reminding us constantly that our hours are finite and our attention is divided. The interrogation room merely makes visible what our daily lives keep hidden, that we are all, in a sense, under observation by instruments of our own design, measuring out our existence in increments that feel increasingly cramped, until we begin to suspect that the scarcity we feel is not truly a limitation of time itself, but rather a limitat. The interrogation room contains a clock, and the suspect knows that every passing minute brings them closer to a decision point, a threshold beyond which their cooperation becomes less valuable and their silence becomes more costly. The interrogator sits across from them and frequently glances at their watch, or better yet, mentions the time explicitly, referencing how long the process has already taken and how much longer it might continue if the suspect does not provide information immediately. This creates an artificial urgency where the suspect begins to perceive their window of opportunity as rapidly closing, where the possibility of lenient treatment or favorable outcomes seems to depend entirely on acting before some invisible deadline expires. The interrogator might say that their supervisors are growing impatient, that other evidence is coming in soon, that the opportunity to tell their side of the story is diminishing with each passing hour, and that those who cooperate early receive better treatment than those who delay and eventually capitulate under pressure when it no longer matters. The psychological mechanism at work involves the human brain's natural aversion to loss and uncertainty, combined with our deeply ingrained preference for immediate resolution over prolonged discomfort. When people feel that time is running out, they tend to abandon careful deliberation and switch into reactive mode, making decisions based on emotion rather than logic, prioritizing the alleviation of present distress over the long-term consequences of their choices. The pressure of a ticking clock creates cognitive narrowing, where the suspect becomes less able to think clearly and more susceptible to suggestion, more willing to accept the interrogator's framing of events simply to escape the mounting anxiety that accompanies the sense of dwindling time. What is remarkable about time pressure as a technique is how thoroughly it has embedded itself into ordinary life, how we have collectively normalized the idea that decisions should be rushed, that delayed responses indicate guilt or evasion, that speed of confession correlates with truthfulness, when in reality the opposite is often true, and yet the technique persists because it works reliably on the human nervous system, regardless of its actual logical validity. A salesman closing a deal by announcing that the offer expires today, a recruiter suggesting that another candidate is waiting in the wings, a negotiator stating that this is the final opportunity to settle. All of these represent the same cognitive hijacking, the same exploitation of our temporal anxiety, deployed not in interrogation rooms, but in the everyday transactions where we surrender our deliberative capacity in exchange for the comfort of resolution. The interrogator understands that once this threshold is crossed, once the suspect has made the emotional decision to cooperate rather than resist, the actual truthfulness of what follows becomes almost irrelevant, because the confession itself, however fabricated or distorted, serves the purpose of closing the case and relieving the unbearable tension that time pressure has created. And so the interrogator's clock becomes a tool not of truth-seeking, but of narrative completion, where the suspect's desperation to escape the relentless pressure of passing minutes matters far more than whether their words align with any objective reality of what actually occurred. Before any interrogation truly begins, the investigator must establish what is known as a baseline, a careful observation of how the subject naturally behaves when they are not yet under suspicion or pressure, a period of time wherein the person sitting across the table exists in their most relaxed and unguarded state, speaking freely about neutral topics, shifting in their chair with no particular awareness, maintaining eye contact with the ease of someone unafraid, breathing at a normal rhythm. Their hands resting naturally on the table or in their lap. The investigator notes everything during this phase: the cadence of speech, the frequency of blinking, the way the person arranges their facial expressions during casual conversation, whether they touch their face often or rarely, how their eyes move when recalling simple memories, the pitch of their voice when discussing the weather or their family, the speed at which they respond to straightforward questions that carry no weight. This baseline becomes the reference point against which all future behavior will be measured, because the theory assumes that when someone begins to lie or experience acute stress, their behavior will deviate measurably from this established pattern, that the anxiety of deception will manifest in detectable ways such as decreased eye contact, increased touching of the face or neck, changes in speech patterns, shifts in posture, alterations in breathing, or modifications to their rate of blinking. The logic seems sound. If you know how someone acts when calm, you can identify when they become anxious or dishonest by observing meaningful departures from that baseline. Yet this technique persists despite significant research suggesting that stress and lying do not produce consistent, easily identifiable behavioral changes across different individuals, that some people become still when anxious while others become restless, that some liars experience no stress whatsoever because they have rationalized their deception or feel justified in it, and that innocent people under interrogation often display the very same stress responses that might suggest guilt. The baseline reading continues to be taught, practiced, and trusted in interrogation rooms worldwide, a foundational element of many interview techniques, even though it rests on assumptions about human behavior that are far more fragile than the confidence interrogators place in them, a persistent methodology that has somehow weathered decades of contradictory evidence. The interrogator sits with this contradiction unresolved, armed with a tool that feels precise and scientific, while operating on premises that are fundamentally uncertain, and proceeds anyway because the alternative, acknowledging that behavior is too variable and context-dependent to serve as reliable proof, would require dismantling much of what modern interrogation has been built upon. So the baseline persists in interrogation manuals and training programs, taught with the certainty of established science, even as practitioners occasionally notice the uncomfortable moments when an innocent person's racing heart and averted gaze look identical to a guilty one's, when the methodology offers no way to distinguish between them. And in those uncomfortable moments, the interrogator must choose: trust the baseline despite its limitations, or acknowledge uncertainty and risk appearing less competent than the science promises they should be. In the interrogation room, the investigator sits across from a suspect, watching not for what is said, but for what flickers across the face in the space of a fraction of a second, those involuntary muscular contractions that betray genuine emotion beneath the constructed facade of composure. The microexpression, lasting anywhere from 1/25th to 1/5 of a second, is believed to reveal the truth that deliberate speech cannot conceal, a momentary leakage of authentic feeling before the social mask snaps back into place. The interrogator has trained themselves to notice the subtle tightening around the eyes that might indicate fear, the barely perceptible downturn of the mouth corners that could suggest contempt or sadness, the microflash of surprise that vanishes almost before it appears. This technique rests on the foundation that the human face, controlled by both voluntary and involuntary muscle groups, cannot entirely suppress genuine emotional responses, and that these fleeting expressions offer a window into the suspect's true psychological state, revealing whether they are lying about their knowledge or involvement in a crime. The logic seems sound in principle. Emotions are biological responses, and the face is the primary display system for these responses, so observing the face should logically provide access to internal truth. Yet the persistence of microexpression analysis in interrogation persists despite mounting scientific evidence, suggesting that the correlation between these facial flickers and deception or guilt is far more tenuous than practitioners believe, and that confirmation bias leads investigators to interpret ambiguous expressions as confirmations of their existing theories about the suspect rather than as objective evidence of deception. The techniques have become so naturalized in investigative practice that their fundamental limitations are rarely questioned, and they continue to influence case outcomes despite the fact that microexpressions can indicate any number of emotional states, many of which have nothing to do with guilt or dishonesty, and that the same expression might mean something entirely different depending on context, culture, and individual variation in expression patterns. A suspect's microflash of fear might stem from anxiety about the interrogation itself rather than guilt, while a flicker of anger could reflect frustration at being accused rather than admission of wrongdoing. Yet these distinctions are rarely preserved in the investigator's final report, where the expression becomes simplified into a checkbox confirming deception. The result is an investigative tool that performs its primary function, providing psychological reassurance to the interrogator that they have perceived objective truth, far more reliably than it performs its stated function of detecting deception, leaving behind a trail of convictions built partly on the interpreter's ability to read faces rather than on evidence that can be independently verified or challenged. In cases where DNA evidence or witness testimony might have exonerated a defendant, microexpression analysis instead became the invisible hand steering the investigation toward conviction, a tool so subjective that two equally trained observers might interpret the same facial movement as either proof of guilt or evidence of innocence. Yet courts have historically treated it with the deference typically reserved for hard science. In the interrogation room, an investigator sits across from a suspect, their eyes moving methodically across the subject's body like a scanner passing over terrain, noting the tension in the shoulders, the angle of the torso, the positioning of the hands, whether they rest openly on the table or curl defensively near the chest, the way the legs cross or uncross, the frequency of swallowing. The microexpressions that flash across the face lasting only fractions of a second before being replaced by a more controlled expression, the dilation or constriction of the pupils, the rate of breathing, and whether it becomes shallow or deep when certain questions are asked. The interrogator has been trained to believe that these bodily manifestations are windows into the psychological state of the person before them, that deception creates internal conflict, and this conflict inevitably leaks out through the body in observable ways that a trained eye can detect and interpret. The theory behind this approach rests on the assumption that our bodies betray us when our minds attempt deception, that conscious control over our words cannot extend to the involuntary systems that govern muscle tension, eye movement, and physiological response. However, the truth is far more complicated and considerably less reliable than this framework suggests, because anxiety manifests identically whether someone is lying about a crime or simply terrified by the interrogation process itself, because innocent people can exhibit the exact same physical signs as guilty ones under stress, because cultural differences influence how people use their bodies to communicate, and because the interrogator's own biases in observing and interpreting these signals will inevitably color what they believe they are seeing. Yet, despite decades of research demonstrating that body language reading in interrogation contexts is substantially unreliable and contributes to false confessions and miscarriages of justice, the practice persists in interrogation rooms across the world, normalized by television dramas and popular culture that have convinced the public that trained observers can simply read guilt from a person's posture the way one reads words from a page. And this belief continues to shape investigative practices even as it systematically fails to distinguish between truth and falsehood with any meaningful accuracy. The investigator across the table, confident in their reading of a twitch or a gaze avoidance, may be witnessing nothing more than a person's natural response to fear and powerlessness, yet their interpretation becomes encoded as evidence, shapes the direction of the investigation, and in the worst cases, becomes the foundation upon which an innocent person's conviction rests. And so the body becomes a text that can be read in infinite ways, each interpretation as valid or invalid as the next, yet treated in the interrogation room as objective fact, a tangible piece of evidence that carries the weight of certainty while resting on nothing but the subjective judgment of a single observer whose confidence in their own perceptions may be the only thing more unreliable than the signals they claim to read. A suspect's trembling hands might indicate guilt, or they might indicate a person who hasn't slept in 30 hours, or whose mother is dying in a hospital across town, or who has a neurological condition, or who is simply terrified of a room with no windows and a door that locks from. In a typical interrogation room, two people sit across from each other at a table, and the interrogator maintains an unwavering gaze toward the subject, rarely breaking eye contact, holding it steady and deliberate while the subject shifts uncomfortably in their chair, looking away, then back again, then down at their hands, the table, anywhere but directly into those fixed eyes that seem to bore through them with an intensity that communicates judgment, authority, and an unspoken challenge to maintain the connection. The interrogator understands that sustained eye contact creates a psychological pressure that operates beneath conscious awareness, a primal signal that derives from our evolutionary history, where direct gazes between individuals carried implications of dominance, threat, or challenge. And this fundamental response still activates in modern humans regardless of our rational understanding that a steady gaze is merely a social convention with no actual power to harm. The subject experiences this maintained eye contact as an invisible weight, a sensation that their thoughts are being read, that any deception will be detected through their inability to hold the gaze, that breaking eye contact first signals weakness or dishonesty, and this belief persists even though extensive psychological research demonstrates that eye contact patterns have no correlation with truthfulness or deception, that innocent people often look away due to cognitive load or anxiety, and that skilled liars can maintain perfect eye contact while fabricating elaborate stories. Yet we continue to interpret eye contact through these ancient frameworks, assigning moral and psychological meaning to a simple visual behavior that is culturally conditioned and individually variable, normalizing the interrogator's use of ocular dominance as a legitimate pressure tactic despite understanding intellectually that the eyes reveal nothing definitive about the contents of a mind. And this disconnect between what we know scientifically and what we believe intuitively about eye contact demonstrates how deeply embedded these nonverbal communication patterns remain in human psychology, operating as powerful tools of social influence precisely because we cannot entirely dismiss them as meaningless even when evidence suggests we should. The interrogator thus weaponizes this contradiction, leveraging the subject's inability to fully rationalize away the discomfort of prolonged eye contact, turning a meaningless behavior into a tool of compliance through the simple act of refusing to look away first, knowing that the subject's eventual capitulation, whether expressed through confession, cooperation, or breakdown, will feel psychologically earned rather than coerced, a victory won through nothing more than the sustained application of human attention. This technique proves particularly effective because the subject internalizes the pressure as self-generated rather than externally imposed. They blame their own inability to maintain eye contact on guilt or instability, never fully recognizing that they are simply responding to an ancient biological reflex that has been deliberately activated and sustained by another person's deliberate refusal to blink, look away, or acknowledge their discomfort. Transforming a basic physiological response into confessional evidence. The mirror technique, also known as mirroring or reflection, is a conversational strategy where an interrogator subtly repeats back the words, phrases, body language, or emotional states of the person being questioned, creating a psychological bridge between interviewer and subject that fosters a sense of rapport and mutual understanding. In a typical interrogation scenario, when a suspect says something like, "I was nowhere near that location that night," the interrogator might respond with a slightly modified repetition, such as, "So you're saying you were nowhere near that location that night," using the exact same cadence and emotional tone, which unconsciously signals to the subject that the interrogator is genuinely listening and genuinely understanding their perspective. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique operates on several interconnected levels. First, mirroring activates what neuroscientists call mirror neurons in the brain, which fire both when an individual performs an action and when they observe another performing that action, creating a neural synchronization that builds unconscious trust and connection. Second, when people hear their own words reflected back to them, they experience a subtle validation of their thoughts and feelings, which naturally makes them feel more comfortable and more willing to share additional information. Third, the mirroring creates an illusion of genuine empathy and understanding, even though the interrogator is merely employing a deliberate technique, which causes the subject to lower their psychological defenses and become more candid. The truly fascinating aspect of the mirror technique is how it persists as one of the most widely taught and recommended interrogation methods, despite the fact that human beings are actually quite sophisticated at detecting when they are being manipulated. Yet somehow we continue to fall for this technique anyway, because the mirroring happens at a subconscious level below our rational awareness. We know intellectually that repetition of our words back to us is a technique, and yet our nervous system responds to it with genuine relaxation and openness, suggesting that these mirror neurons and empathy-building mechanisms operate in a part of our brain that exists somewhat independent of our conscious skepticism. As you listen to this narration, imagine yourself in a quiet room, with someone across from you who reflects your words back to you in a calm, measured tone, validating everything you say, and notice how your body begins to naturally ease into a state of profound relaxation, as the boundary between interrogator and subject dissolves into something that feels like genuine human connection. And perhaps this is why the mirror technique remains so effective across cultures and contexts. It taps into a fundamental human need for being seen and understood, a need so primal that it overrides our learned defenses, making the simple act of mirroring feel less like a manipulation and more like a moment of genuine human recognition. In this sense, the mirror technique transcends its role as a mere interrogation tool and becomes a window into how deeply our brains are wired for connection and reciprocity. A reminder that the most powerful influence over human behavior often comes not from aggressive confrontation, but from the simple, almost invisible act of being truly reflected back to ourselves. In interrogation rooms across the world, trained professionals understand that the most effective path to obtaining information often begins not with confrontation or pressure, but with the deliberate cultivation of connection and mutual understanding between the questioner and the subject. Building rapport is the foundational technique that transforms an adversarial dynamic into something resembling a conversation between acquaintances, where the person being questioned gradually lowers their defenses and begins to view the interrogator not as an enemy seeking their destruction, but as someone who understands them, listens to them, and perhaps even sympathizes with their circumstances. The interrogator will spend considerable time learning details about the subject's background, family, work history, hobbies, and personal struggles, often discovering genuine common ground such as shared hometowns, similar career paths, or mutual acquaintances, and then strategically referencing these connections throughout the interview to reinforce the sense that they are fundamentally similar people engaged in a meaningful dialogue. The psychological mechanism underlying this approach is rooted in basic human neurobiology and our inherent need for social connection and validation. When we feel understood and appreciated by another person, our brain releases oxytocin, which simultaneously increases trust and decreases our natural skepticism and defensive responses, making us more inclined to cooperate, share information, and align ourselves with the goals and perspectives of the person making us feel valued. The interrogator leverages reciprocity as well, sharing their own carefully selected personal anecdotes and vulnerabilities that make them seem more human and relatable, which triggers an almost automatic social obligation in the subject to reciprocate with their own openness and honesty. What makes this technique particularly remarkable is how effectively it operates despite our intellectual awareness of its mechanisms. Even when people understand intellectually that they are being subjected to a deliberate rapport-building strategy, they often find themselves unable to resist its effects, because the human need for connection and social acceptance operates at a level that transcends rational thought and conscious resistance, embedding itself so deeply in our evolutionary biology that manufactured warmth and feigned understanding can feel indistinguishable from genuine human connection. And we have normalized this dynamic so thoroughly in our daily lives that we rarely pause to recognize how thoroughly we are willing to open ourselves to people who make us feel seen and appreciated, regardless of their ultimate intentions. This is precisely why skilled interrogators view rapport building not merely as a tactic, but as perhaps the most powerful tool in their arsenal, a technique that succeeds not despite human nature, but because of it, exploiting our fundamental architecture in ways that feel entirely consensual to the person being questioned, who may later struggle to explain how they came to reveal information they had sworn never to divulge. The interrogator's mastery of rapport ultimately rests on understanding that resistance to questioning is not primarily a logical choice, but an emotional one, a protective barrier that dissolves only when the subject's need for human connection and validation overwhelms their instinct for self-preservation. The interrogator enters the room with a demeanor of genuine concern, their body language open and relaxed, their voice carrying the warmth of someone who understands the weight of the situation rather than someone seeking to exploit it. They sit across from the subject, not behind a table but beside them, establishing a spatial intimacy that suggests alliance rather than adversarial positioning, and they begin by acknowledging the difficulty of the person's circumstances, validating the emotional and psychological strain that has led them to this moment. The interrogator might speak softly about how they recognize the subject is a good person caught in unfortunate circumstances, how they understand that desperation or fear or confusion might have motivated certain actions, and how they themselves see the world in shades of gray rather than absolutes. They offer water, adjust the lighting to be less harsh, suggest comfort adjustments, and speak about their own doubts regarding the institution they represent, creating a sense of shared skepticism toward the system itself. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique relies on the fundamental human need for social connection and the powerful influence of perceived empathy and understanding on our willingness to disclose information and confess. When a person feels truly heard and understood rather than judged or threatened, they experience a significant reduction in defensive barriers and a corresponding increase in the desire to reciprocate that emotional openness, a phenomenon known as reciprocal vulnerability that operates across almost all human relationships. The sympathetic approach exploits this basic neurological and emotional architecture by making confession feel less like capitulation to an adversary and more like a cathartic sharing with someone who genuinely cares about understanding the full truth of what happened. What remains remarkable is how powerfully this technique continues to succeed despite our intellectual awareness of its mechanism. How even when we know that someone is employing strategic empathy, we often find ourselves responding to it anyway, suggesting that our rational understanding of manipulation remains perpetually separate from our emotional and instinctive responses to human warmth and acceptance. This paradox reveals that interrogation, at its core, is fundamentally about exploiting not our weaknesses but our strengths, our capacity for trust, our desire to be understood, our need to unburden ourselves to another human being, which means the most effective interrogators are often those who have genuinely cultivated the ability to listen without judgment, making the line between authentic empathy and strategic performance impossibly thin even for the interrogator themselves. Perhaps this is why the sympathetic approach remains one of the most ethically fraught interrogation methods, not because it is crude or violent, but because its success depends on a genuine human skill that, when weaponized, transforms one of our finest capacities into an instrument of extraction, leaving both interrogator and subject fundamentally changed by an encounter that mimicked intimacy while serving only the apparatus of control. And yet, in this corruption of empathy lies a paradox that troubles even seasoned practitioners. The interrogator who becomes too skilled at genuine listening may find themselves actually believing in the subject's account, creating a crisis of conscience. The interrogator sits across from the suspect in a small room, and rather than continuing with factual questions or logical contradictions in the narrative, they shift their approach entirely to something more personal and intimate, speaking in softer tones about the suspect's family, their children waiting at home, their aging parents who depend on them, their reputation in the community, the disappointment they will face from loved ones, the shame that will follow them through their remaining years. The way their name will be remembered not for their accomplishments, but for this single moment of failure or transgression. The interrogator might place a sympathetic hand on the shoulder and speak about understanding the pressures that led to this point, acknowledging the genuine hardships and struggles that anyone in their position would have faced, creating a sense of shared humanity and mutual recognition rather than adversarial confrontation. This technique operates on the principle that human beings are fundamentally driven by emotional bonds and social belonging rather than purely rational calculation, and that appeals to these deep psychological needs can sometimes move someone to confess or cooperate in ways that threats or logic cannot achieve. The mechanism functions because our brains are wired to respond more powerfully to narratives of family, loss, shame, and redemption than to abstract principles or evidence, and because the desire to resolve internal conflict and emotional distress often outweighs the strategic advantage of remaining silent or maintaining a false story. What makes emotional appeal particularly persistent as a technique is that it continues to work precisely because it acknowledges something true about human nature, even as we have become increasingly aware of its manipulative dimension and its capacity to elicit false confessions when combined with other pressures and suggestions. Yet we remain vulnerable to it nonetheless because the emotional pulls it activates exist beneath the level of conscious rational defense. A detective might speak of giving the suspect a chance to do the right thing and face their family with integrity rather than have the truth emerge later, framing confession as a path to redemption and self-respect. Or they might invoke the victim's suffering, asking the suspect to imagine the pain of the bereaved and positioning cooperation as an act of compassion that could begin to repair an irreparable harm. The power of this approach lies partly in its duality. It can genuinely offer a path towards psychological relief and moral resolution for someone racked with guilt, while simultaneously exploiting that very guilt to override critical judgment, making it nearly impossible for the confessor to distinguish afterward between a confession born of authentic remorse and one coerced through emotional manipulation. This ambiguity is precisely why emotional appeal remains one of the most ethically fraught interrogation techniques. It leaves both interrogator and suspect uncertain about the ground truth of the confession itself, creating a permanent epistemological shadow over what was actually admitted, and why a shadow that can never be fully dispelled even when the confession is later corroborated by evidence or retracted as false. The rational approach to interrogation operates on a deceptively simple premise: that human beings are fundamentally logical creatures who will respond favorably to clear reasoning, factual evidence, and intellectual persuasion when presented with sound arguments about their own self-interest. An interrogator employing this technique presents information in a measured, calm manner, avoiding emotional appeals or aggressive posturing, instead laying out the logical consequences of cooperation versus non-cooperation with methodical precision and clarity. The investigator might say something like, "Based on the evidence we have, the most rational choice for you is to provide your account of events, because the physical evidence we have collected will speak for itself regardless, and your cooperation now demonstrates to the court that you are a reasonable person capable of rational thought," thereby framing confession or cooperation as the intelligent decision rather than the desperate capitulation. This technique relies on the assumption that when people are given adequate information and sufficient time to process it, they will naturally arrive at conclusions that serve their own best interests, and that this intellectual appeal to reason transcends emotion, fear, or psychological manipulation. The psychological mechanism underlying this approach stems from the cognitive bias known as the illusion of transparency, wherein interrogators often overestimate how persuasive logical arguments truly are, and simultaneously underestimate how much a person's decision-making capacity is compromised by stress, fatigue, and the power differential inherent in an interrogation room. What makes the rational approach particularly fascinating is how it persists as an interrogation method despite substantial psychological research demonstrating that under conditions of high stress, sleep deprivation, and coercive pressure, the human brain's rational faculties are dramatically impaired, and people become more susceptible to confabulation, false memory formation, and agreement with whatever narrative seems most likely to end their discomfort. Yet interrogators continue employing rational argumentation in these contexts, operating under the assumption that clarity and reason will prevail, when in fact they are relying on a fundamental misunderstanding of how human cognition functions under duress, creating an ironic situation where the very technique designed to appeal to rationality works precisely because people's rational processes have been compromised by the interrogation environment itself. In this paradox lies a troubling insight. The rational approach succeeds not because it appeals to reason, but because it disguises coercion in the language of logic, allowing both interrogator and suspect to maintain the comfortable fiction that a confession emerged from deliberation rather than desperation, thereby obscuring the coercive nature of the entire enterprise behind a veneer of intellectual respectability. This self-deception serves a crucial function. It permits interrogators to view themselves as sophisticated practitioners of evidence-based persuasion rather than coercive agents, while simultaneously providing suspects with a psychologically palatable explanation for their own capitulation. They can tell themselves they were convinced, not broken, a narrative that proves far easier to live with than the alternative. The direct approach in interrogation represents perhaps the most straightforward of all questioning techniques, one where the investigator abandons pretense entirely and simply asks the subject point-blank about their suspected involvement in whatever crime or transgression has brought them into the room. There is no elaborate setup, no careful maneuvering through seemingly innocent questions, no building of rapport before the real interrogation begins, but rather an immediate and unambiguous statement of purpose followed by direct questions about the matter at hand. The investigator might open by saying they know the subject was present at the location in question, or that evidence points to their involvement, and they ask without hesitation whether the subject committed the act, what their motivations were, whether they acted alone, and any other relevant details pertaining to the investigation. The psychological mechanism underlying the effectiveness of this technique rests upon several interconnected principles that have been observed repeatedly in human behavior across different cultures and contexts. First, the directness itself can create a disorienting effect in the subject, particularly if they have prepared themselves mentally for an extended back and forth that never arrives, leaving them psychologically unbalanced and more prone to verbal mistakes or confessions born from the desire to simply end the interaction. Second, innocent people often respond to direct accusation with confusion and immediate denial, accompanied by detailed explanations of their innocence, a reflexive need to restore the balance that the accusation has created in the social equilibrium, whereas guilty parties frequently become defensive, evasive, and less coherent in their denials. Third, the directness communicates absolute confidence in the investigator's case, which can psychologically convince the subject that further deception is futile and that cooperation might be their only path to any form of mercy or understanding. What remains remarkable is how this technique persists as a foundational interrogation method despite the emergence of far more sophisticated psychological and investigative procedures, suggesting that human psychology remains fundamentally unchanged in its response to direct confrontation with authority figures presenting accusation as established fact. Yet the technique's simplicity belies its risks. False confessions have emerged from overly aggressive direct confrontations, particularly when combined with isolation, sleep deprivation, or implicit threats, leading modern interrogation standards in many jurisdictions to require corroborating evidence before such methods are employed, and to mandate recording of the entire process to protect both subject and investigator alike. The paradox, then, is that the direct approach's very potency as a psychological tool demands the careful scaffolding of legal and procedural safeguards that the technique itself seems to reject, transforming what was once a simple confrontation into a precisely choreographed performance where transparency and documentation become as essential as the questioning itself. In this sense, the direct approach has evolved from a crude instrument of coercion into a methodologically refined practice where the investigator's confidence must be earned through legitimate evidence rather than merely performed, and where the subject's voluntary cooperation becomes more valuable thought. A leading question is one in which the interrogator subtly embeds the answer they desire within the phrasing of the question itself, effectively suggesting what response they expect or prefer the subject to provide. In a real interrogation room, an officer might ask a suspect something like, "You were angry when he said that to you, weren't you?" rather than simply asking, "How did you feel when he said that?" The first phrasing presupposes anger and merely asks for confirmation, while the second allows the subject to articulate their genuine emotional state without suggestion. The interrogator crafts these questions with careful precision, layering assumptions into the grammatical structure so that agreement becomes the path of least resistance for the suspect, who may be fatigued, confused, or simply seeking to end the ordeal by accepting the narrative the officer has constructed. The psychological mechanism at work here is fundamentally about cognitive ease and social conformity. Human beings have a natural tendency to agree rather than disagree, and when a question is framed in a way that presupposes a particular reality, the subject experiences less mental friction by simply accepting that presupposed reality than by constructing an alternative narrative from scratch. The leading question exploits what researchers call the compliance effect, where repeated exposure to a suggested answer makes that answer seem increasingly plausible and acceptable to the subject's own mind. Over time, through repeated leading questions, a suspect may actually begin to believe their own false confession, having been guided incrementally toward admitting to something they may not have done. What is remarkable is how persistent this technique remains in investigative procedures despite decades of research demonstrating its unreliability and its profound potential for generating false confessions and wrongful convictions. We have normalized the leading question so thoroughly in our systems of justice that it continues to be employed extensively, even though it produces information that is fundamentally compromised by suggestion rather than grounded in genuine memory or truthful disclosure. The irony is particularly acute when we consider that the very mechanisms designed to protect the innocent, the structured interview, the documented questioning process, can become instruments of their undoing, transforming suggestibility from a minor cognitive quirk into a catastrophic vulnerability within a system that mistakes compliance for truth. The suspect sitting across from the interrogator's desk does not experience themselves as having been led. They experience themselves as having remembered, as having finally admitted to what they deep down knew to be true, and this subjective certainty becomes almost impossible to later untangle from the suggestion that planted it there in the first place. This phenomenon has given rise to documented cases where individuals have confessed in meticulous detail to crimes they could not possibly have committed, their false memories so thoroughly constructed through leading questions that polygraph tests and their own conviction in the narrative seem to corroborate guilt that never existed. The architecture of the leading question, then, reveals a fundamental paradox in interrogation. The more skilled the interrogator becomes at extracting a confession, the less reliable that confession becomes as evidence of actual wrongdoing. Baiting is an interrogation technique wherein an investigator deliberately presents false information, manufactured evidence, or fabricated statements to a suspect, essentially dangling an enticing narrative in front of them with the calculated hope that the suspect will correct the interrogator or fill in details. thereby inadvertently confessing to aspects of the crime or revealing knowledge that only the perpetrator would possess. In a typical baiting scenario, a detective might tell a suspect that their fingerprints were found at a crime scene when no such evidence exists, or claim that a witness has already identified them as the perpetrator when no such identification has occurred, betting that the innocent suspect will panic and begin explaining their presence at that location or their actions during the relevant time period. While a guilty suspect might become so agitated by the false accusation that they begin arguing about which specific details the detective has wrong, thereby revealing intimate knowledge of the crime itself. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the creation of acute psychological pressure through the introduction of what appears to be damning evidence, which causes the suspect to experience what researchers call cognitive urgency, a state where the normal rational filters that prevent people from speaking freely become compromised by the immediate need to address what they perceive as an existential threat to their freedom. The baiting technique operates on the assumption that innocent people will calmly deny accusations and request legal representation, while guilty people will be unable to resist the compulsion to correct details or argue against false specifics, thereby revealing their actual knowledge of events. What makes baiting persist as a technique, despite its fundamental unreliability, is the simple fact that occasionally it does produce results. And interrogators remember the cases where a suspect's desperate correction of details led to a confession far more vividly than they remember the countless cases where an innocent person simply became confused or angry. A phenomenon known as selective memory bias that has allowed this technique to maintain its presence in interrogation rooms across decades despite mounting evidence that it produces false confessions at alarming rates. Research has documented numerous cases where innocent individuals, particularly those with lower education levels, cognitive vulnerabilities, or mental health conditions, have confessed to crimes they did not commit after being subjected to baiting tactics, underscoring the technique's particular danger when applied to society's most defenseless populations. Modern interrogation reform movements have begun to restrict or prohibit baiting in jurisdictions that have recognized that the technique's unreliability far outweighs any investigative utility it might occasionally provide. Some jurisdictions have adopted video recording requirements for all custodial interrogations, which has made the coercive nature of baiting tactics immediately visible to juries and judges, thereby reducing both their use and their effectiveness as a tool for securing convictions that might otherwise be overturned on appeal. The shift toward evidence-based interrogation methods, such as the cognitive interview technique that focuses on eliciting accurate information rather than manufacturing confessions, represents a fundamental acknowledgement that the false friend technique operates as one of the most psychologically sophisticated interrogation methods, wherein an interrogator deliberately positions themselves as an ally or confidant to the subject, establishing a rapport that feels genuine and trustworthy while simultaneously extracting sensitive information through seemingly casual conversation and strategic emotional manipulation. In real interrogation scenarios, this technique unfolds gradually over extended periods, with the interrogator presenting themselves as the only person in the subject's corner, the one person who truly understands their situation and wants to help them navigate the legal and personal consequences they face, while carefully constructing a narrative wherein cooperation with the interrogator becomes framed as the subject's best path forward and the only reasonable choice available to them. The interrogator might express sympathy for the subject's circumstances, suggest that their actions were understandable given the pressures they faced, or imply that other officials in the system are far more hostile and punitive, thereby positioning the interrogator as a protective figure standing between the subject and genuine harm. The psychological mechanism underlying this technique's effectiveness rests upon several fundamental human vulnerabilities: our deep need for social connection and acceptance, our tendency to trust those who demonstrate apparent understanding of our emotional state, and our susceptibility to consistency principles, wherein once we've established a friendly rapport with someone, we become motivated to maintain that relationship through reciprocal disclosure and honesty. The subject gradually begins to see the interrogator not as an adversary, but as someone invested in their welfare, and this perceptual shift fundamentally alters how they process requests for information, making refusal feel like a betrayal of the relationship they've come to value. What persists despite its obvious logical problems is how naturally humans embrace this dynamic, how readily we interpret sympathy as genuine care rather than strategic positioning, and how the comfort of feeling understood in a hostile environment can override our rational assessment of whether the person providing that comfort might have competing interests and motivations that directly conflict with our own well-being and freedom. The interrogator's strategic advantage lies partly in the subject's own cognitive biases, the belief that someone who has listened to them for hours must genuinely care, that the time invested represents authentic interest rather than calculated investment in extracting a confession. Once a subject has confided details to their false friend, they often experience a compulsion to maintain internal consistency, rationalizing their disclosures as evidence of trustworthiness rather than recognizing them as precisely what the technique was designed to produce: incremental capitulation. The interrogator then leverages these confessions, however minor or tangential, as evidence of the subject's guilt and willingness to cooperate, progressively narrowing the psychological space between denial and confession, until the subject finds themselves narrating a complete account of events they may not have fully committed, simply to maintain the consistency and approval of the relationship they've internalized as their sole source of support within an otherwise adversarial system.